Derek Collins slammed his palm into the old man's chest and shoved him backward across the gym floor, laughing as Walter Hayes stumbled into a bucket of dirty mop water and crashed to the ground in front of 40 students filming on their phones. "That's what happens when the janitor gets in my way," Derek shouted, holding his hands up for the cameras while the room exploded into laughter. Nobody in that gym knew they had just humiliated the man who once trained 3 world champions. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and follow this channel so you don't miss a single second of what happens next, because I promise you this story is going to shock you. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Walter Hayes and the day his silence finally ran out. Nobody clapped when Walter Hayes fell into that bucket. Nobody helped him up either. For a long, ugly moment, all 40 students just stood there laughing, phones raised, capturing every second of it for the internet, and Walter lay on the wet tile floor with dirty water soaking through his gray uniform, staring up at the fluorescent lights, saying absolutely nothing. That silence was the thing nobody understood about him. For 10 years, Walter Hayes had walked into Victory Combat Academy at 5 in the morning alone, unlocking the doors before the sun came up, before the coaches arrived, before the fighters stumbled in half asleep with their gym bags over their shoulders. He mopped the mats. He wiped down the mirrors until they shined. He fixed the broken heavy bags with his own 2 hands, stitching leather that most people would have thrown away. And every single day he did it without a single complaint, without asking for recognition, without ever once mentioning who he used to be. To the young fighters training inside those walls, Walter was invisible. He was the old man with the mop, the one who smelled like bleach, the one who never talked much, never smiled much, and never seemed to notice or care about the world of trophies and titles and Instagram followers swirling around him every single day. But invisible men see everything. Walter had watched hundreds of fighters walk through that gym over the years. He had watched arrogance destroy talented young men before their bodies ever gave out. And when Derek Collins first walked into Victory Combat Academy 3 years earlier, 17 years old, cocky, dripping with natural talent, Walter had felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not jealousy, not resentment, recognition. He had seen this before. He had seen exactly what happens to a young man who is told over and over again that he is untouchable. "Move, old man." That was usually all Derek said to him. 2 words tossed over his shoulder like garbage as he strutted past Walter with his entourage of hangers on his sponsors' logos stitched across his chest, his phone constantly recording every second of his own life for an audience that adored him. Derek Collins had 15 straight wins by the time he turned 25. 15, undefeated. A black belt with a smile made for cameras and a right hook that had put grown men to sleep on live television. He had 2.3 million followers online, a clothing line, an energy drink sponsorship, and a father whose name opened doors that most fighters spent their entire careers trying to knock down. Derek believed with his whole chest that respect was something you took, not something you earned. "You know what I love about this sport?" Derek said one afternoon, sitting on the edge of the mat while a camera crew from a sports channel set up around him, "is that it separates people. There's people who fight, and there's everybody else. Everybody else just watches." Behind him, mopping quietly near the entrance, Walter said nothing. He never did. But that day, something shifted. That day, Derek decided the old janitor was going to be part of his content. "Yo," Derek called out, snapping his fingers toward Walter like he was hailing a waiter. "Old man, come here for a second." Walter kept mopping. "I said come here." The gym went quiet. A few students exchanged glances. Eli Parker, a 10-year-old boy sitting on the bleachers lacing up his gloves, looked up with wide, nervous eyes. Walter finally set them up against the wall and walked over. Calm, unhurried, his hands folded in front of him. "Yes, Derek. You've been cleaning this place for how long? Like a decade, right?" "Something like that." Derek smirked at the camera. "A decade, mopping floors. And you know what's crazy? In that same 10 years, I went from a white belt kid to the most followed fighter in this entire gym's history. Kind of makes you wonder what some people do with their lives, huh?" A few students laughed nervously. Not because it was funny, because Derek expected them to. Walter's jaw tightened just barely. His eyes calm and steady held Derek's gaze for a long moment. "Everybody's got a race to run, son," Walter said quietly. "Just make sure you're not too busy watching everyone else's to notice when yours ends." For a split second, something flickered across Derek's face. Confusion. Maybe even a flash of something like fear gone as fast as it appeared. Then he laughed it off. "Deep, real deep, old man. You should write fortune cookies." The camera crew laughed with him. Walter turned and walked back to his mop. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, Derek decided the joke needed a punchline. The gym was packed that afternoon, more crowded than usual, because word had spread that Derek was filming content for a new sponsorship announcement. Bright lights, extra cameras, students crowding the edges of the mat, trying to get in frame, trying to be near him, trying to catch a piece of his shine. Walter had just finished mopping near the water station when Derek came jogging past mid-conversation with his manager phone, raised narrating his own workout for his followers. "And this," Derek said into the camera, gesturing toward Walter without even looking at him, "is basically the mascot of this gym. Everybody say hi to." He shoved Walter. Hard. Both hands straight into the old man's chest. No warning, no hesitation. Just pure careless force. The kind of shove you give someone you have decided doesn't matter enough to be careful with. Walter's feet slid across the wet tile. His arms flailed for half a second, searching for balance that wasn't there, and then his body twisted backward and crashed directly into a mop bucket, sending dirty gray water splashing across the floor and soaking through his uniform. The room erupted. Laughter. Phones. Flashes. Someone yelled, "Oh my God," between fits of laughter. Someone else screamed, "Post that right now." Derek stood over him, hands raised triumphantly, like he had just won a title fight, grinning ear to ear for the camera. "That's what happens when the janitor gets in my way," Derek announced, loud enough for every phone in the room to catch it clearly. Walter lay on the ground for a moment, water soaking his back, the laughter ringing in his ears, his hands pressed flat against the cold tile. And in that moment, something old and buried deep inside Walter Hayes stirred quiet and heavy, like a sleeping giant shifting in its sleep. He did not show it. His face stayed calm. His breathing stayed even. Slowly, deliberately, Walter pushed himself up off the ground, water dripping from his sleeves, and looked directly at Derek Collins with an expression that made the laughter around them slowly, uncomfortably start to fade. "Careful, son," Walter said quietly, so quietly that only the people closest could hear it. "Some doors, once you open them, you can't close again." Derek blinked. For half a second, the smile faltered. Then he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Whatever, old man. Go dry off." He turned back to his camera, already moving on, already forgetting. Because to Derek Collins, Walter Hayes was nothing more than a piece of background scenery in the story of his own greatness. But he had just made a mistake that would follow him for the rest of his life. That video went up online within the hour. Derek captioned it, "When the help forgets their place, laughing emoji, fire emoji, 2.3 million followers ready to click." By that night, it had 400,000 views. By the next morning, it had 2 million. Comments flooded in from every direction, most of them cruel, most of them laughing along with Derek, mocking the old man in the video, calling him pathetic, calling him a punching bag, calling him exactly the kind of person the internet loves to throw away. Somewhere in Austin, in a small apartment above a laundromat, Walter Hayes sat alone at his kitchen table that night, staring at nothing, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. On the shelf behind him, beneath a folded gray towel, sat a wooden box he had not opened in over a decade. He did not open it that night either, but for the first time in 10 years, he thought about it. The next morning, Walter arrived at 5 o'clock exactly just like every single day before it. He unlocked the doors, he turned on the lights, he picked up his mop. If anyone expected him to quit, to disappear, to never show his face again after being humiliated in front of millions of strangers online, they were about to learn something important about Walter Hayes. He did not run from storms. He had lived through the worst one of his life already, and he was still standing. What nobody in that gym knew yet What Derek Collins had no idea of as he strutted in later that morning, wearing sunglasses indoors and soaking up the attention from students who had watched the viral video and now treated him like even more of a legend, was that Walter Hayes had spent this quiet morning making a decision. He was not angry. Anger was too small a word for what moved through him. He was remembering. And somewhere in the back of that gym on the far wall behind the heavy bags sat a 10-year-old boy named Eli Parker, quietly practicing the same punch over and over again, throwing it wrong every single time, his shoulders too tight, his balance too far forward, his coaches too busy filming Derek's latest post to notice a struggling kid in the corner. Nobody had been able to fix Eli's stance in 3 months of training. Nobody, until Walter walked past with his mop that same morning and stopped. "Try it again," Walter said quietly, setting the mop against the wall. Eli froze, startled. "Me? You're dropping your right shoulder before you throw. That's why the punch keeps sailing wide." The boy blinked up at him, confused. "How do you know that?" Walter crouched down slightly, his old knees protesting the movement, and gently adjusted the boy's foot, sliding it 2 inches to the left, then placed 2 fingers against his shoulder, pressing it back into alignment. "Throw it again," Walter said. Eli hesitated, glanced around to make sure nobody was watching, and threw the punch. It landed clean, sharp, perfect, the kind of punch that took most students months to develop. Eli's eyes went wide. "Whoa!" "Again," Walter said. The boy threw it again, then again, each one cleaner than the last. Across the gym, one of the assistant coaches, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who had been training fighters for 15 years, happened to glance over during a water break and stopped mid-sip his cup frozen halfway to his mouth. He watched Eli throw 6 perfect punches in a row. 6. A kid who had been throwing that same punch wrong for 3 straight months. Marcus's eyes slowly drifted from the boy's fists to the old man standing quietly beside him, arms folded, watching with the calm, focused expression of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. "Hayes," Marcus called out slowly, "how long you been doing that?" Walter didn't turn around right away. When he finally did, his face gave nothing away. "Doing what?" "That," Marcus said, pointing at Eli, who was still throwing perfect punches, grinning now, completely unaware of the weight of what had just happened around him. "That's not luck. That's not a lucky adjustment. That's coaching. Real coaching." Walter picked his mop back up. "Floor's wet over by the lockers," he said simply, and walked away. Marcus stood there for a long moment, staring after him, a strange, uneasy feeling settling into his chest, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you've been looking at something every single day for years without actually seeing it. That feeling would not go away. If anything, it would only grow stronger over the following weeks. Because Eli Parker was not the only student Walter quietly helped. A 16-year-old girl named Sophie, who had been struggling with her footwork for months, found her balance corrected during a 5-second conversation with the janitor while he was wiping down the mirrors. A grown man in his 30s, a hobbyist fighter preparing for his first amateur bout, mentioned offhand to Walter that his jab felt weak, and within 2 sentences of advice found himself throwing the cleanest jab of his life. Word started to spread quietly through the gym, whispers between students, confused glances toward the old man with the mop. "Did you see what he did with Eli's stance? He told me to rotate my hip differently, and it completely changed my kick. Who even is this guy?" Nobody asked Walter directly, and Walter never volunteered an answer. He simply kept mopping, kept fixing equipment, kept arriving before the sun rose, and leaving long after most students had gone home. But Derek Collins noticed the whispers too, and he did not like them. "People are saying the janitor's like secretly good at this stuff," Derek said one evening, lounging against the ring ropes while his manager scrolled through his phone beside him. "It's ridiculous. He probably just got lucky with a couple corrections. People will believe anything these days." "Maybe," his manager said absently, not really listening. "I mean, come on," Derek continued louder now, making sure the nearby students could hear him. "The guy mops floors for a living. If he actually knew anything about fighting, don't you think he'd have..." I don't know. Done something with his life by now. Nobody answered him. A few students shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the back of the gym, where Walter was quietly repairing a torn heavy bag, his hands moving with practiced precision, threading a needle through thick leather, like he had done it 10,000 times before. Because he had. Derek's ego, already inflated from millions of followers and 15 straight wins, could not tolerate the idea that anyone, especially a janitor, might be receiving more respect from the students than he was. And so, over the following 2 weeks, his mockery of Walter escalated from careless jokes into something colder, something crueler. He started locking Walter's cleaning supplies in a storage closet, forcing the old man to search for a spare key every morning while students watched and snickered. He would wait until Walter finished mopping a section of floor, then deliberately knock over a water bottle or spill a protein shake across the exact spot, forcing him to start over while offering an insincere apology dripping with sarcasm. "Oops," Derek would say, smirking. "My bad, old man. Guess you'll have to do it again." One afternoon, in front of nearly the entire gym, Derek made Walter bow to him. "Come on," Derek said, filming on his phone, grinning at the small crowd that had gathered. "Show some respect around here. Bow to the champ." Walter stood still for a long moment, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. The room waited. Slowly, Walter bowed his head. Just slightly, just enough to satisfy the cameras. Derek laughed, victorious, turning to his phone to caption the moment for his followers. But Marcus, standing near the back of the room, saw something Derek didn't. He saw the way Walter's eyes never left Derek's face during that bow. He saw the stillness in the old man's shoulders, the complete absence of humiliation in his posture, as though the gesture cost him absolutely nothing at all. It wasn't submission. Marcus realized with a chill crawling up the back of his neck that it looked almost like patience, like a man choosing very deliberately not to do something he was fully capable of doing. That night, after the gym had emptied out and the lights had been shut off one by one, Walter sat alone in the small back office where cleaning supplies were kept, staring down at his own hands. Old hands. Weathered hands. Hands that had once wrapped fighters' knuckles before championship bouts. Hands that had once held a trophy so heavy it took 2 arms to lift. Hands that had once held his son's hand, small and warm, guiding him through his very first stance on a mat that felt like a lifetime ago. Walter closed his eyes. He thought about the wooden box on his shelf at home, still unopened, still sealed with a promise he had made to himself 10 years earlier, a promise that he would never again step foot into that world, the world that had taken everything from him. He thought about Eli Parker's perfect punches, about the fire in that boy's eyes when something finally clicked. He thought about Derek Collins, 25 years old, drowning in a fame he had not yet earned the wisdom to carry, headed down a road that Walter had watched destroy better men than him. And for the first time in 10 years, Walter Hayes felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it was gone. It wasn't anger at Derek, it was recognition. Because underneath all that arrogance, underneath the sponsorships and the millions of followers and the 15 straight wins, Walter saw a young man who reminded him painfully, unbearably, of someone else. Someone who had also once believed that talent alone was enough. Someone who had also once needed a hard lesson before it was too late. Someone Walter had failed to save in time. His hands trembled slightly on the table. "Not again," he whispered to the empty room. "Not this time." The following week, everything changed. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during the gym's busiest hours when Derek decided he wanted something bigger than a shove, bigger than a forced bow, bigger than a spilled drink. He wanted content that would break the internet completely. And he had the perfect target standing right in front of him with a mop in his hands. "Hey, everybody!" Derek called out, raising his voice so the entire gym could hear his phone already recording his manager, already setting up better lighting nearby, because he could sense something big was about to happen. "I've got an idea." Walter stopped mopping and looked up slowly. Derek walked toward him, confident, grinning, playing to the growing crowd of students who had started to gather, sensing the tension building in the room, the way people always seem to sense when something dramatic is about to unfold. "You've been working here, 10 years?" Derek said. 10 years of mopping floors and everybody in this gym is suddenly acting like you're some secret martial arts master because you fixed a kid's punch. He laughed, shaking his head. I think it's time we settled this, for real. The room went quiet. Settled what exactly? Walter asked calmly. 60 seconds, Derek said, loud enough for every phone in the room to catch clearly. You survive 60 seconds against me, and I'll admit in front of everybody, in front of my entire following online, that you're not just a janitor, that you're actually something special. He spread his arms wide, grinning at the crowd. But if you fold in the first 10 seconds like everybody thinks you will, then you finally admit what we all already know, that you're nothing but an old man with a mop who got lucky a couple times. Students exchanged nervous glances. Someone whispered, "Is he serious right now?" Someone else whispered back, "Derek's going to destroy him." Marcus stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Derek, come on, man. This isn't—" "Stay out of it, Marcus," Derek snapped, not taking his eyes off Walter. "This is between me and him." The entire gym waited, breath-held phones raised for Walter to do exactly what everyone expected. To shake his head, to apologize quietly, to walk away with his mop and disappear into the back room like he always did. Instead, Walter set the mop gently against the wall, straightened his back slowly, and looked directly into Derek Collins's eyes with a calm, steady expression that made the young fighter's confident smile falter just slightly for the second time in 2 weeks. "Son," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Everybody falls eventually. Some people just haven't met the floor yet." The room went completely, utterly silent. Derek's smile flickered uncertain for half a second before he forced it back into place, laughing it off for the cameras. "Is that a yes, old man?" Walter held his gaze steady as stone. "Sunday," Walter said. "Give me until Sunday." And as the words left his mouth, as the gym erupted into stunned whispers, and Derek's manager scrambled to start planning the biggest live stream of his client's career, nobody in that room, not Derek, not Marcus, not even the students who had spent months quietly wondering about the old janitor's mysterious past, had any idea what they had just set in motion. Because 300 miles away in a small gym in Dallas, a former heavyweight champion was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. And in a wooden box on a shelf in a quiet apartment above a laundromat, a black belt that had not seen daylight in 10 years was about to be unburied. Walter Hayes walked to the back office that evening, closed the door quietly behind him, and for the first time in a decade, allowed himself to remember exactly who he used to be. Because Sunday was coming, and the man Derek Collins was about to face in that ring was not a janitor at all. The wooden box had been sitting on that shelf for so long that dust had settled into the grooves of the carved lid, but when Walter Hayes finally lifted it down that Thursday night, his hands did not shake from age. They shook from memory. He set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before he opened it. Inside, folded neatly, was a black belt worn soft and pale at the edges from thousands of hours of training. Beneath it sat a stack of photographs, their corners curling with time. Walter lifted the top one slowly. 3 young men stood shoulder to shoulder in that photograph, sweat still glistening on their faces, championship belts held high above their heads, and standing in the middle of them, one arm around each man's shoulders, stood a much younger Walter Hayes, grinning wider than anyone in that gym had ever seen him grin. "Coach Hayes," he whispered to himself, tasting the name like something foreign in his own mouth. Nobody had called him that in 10 years. He set the photograph down and picked up his phone, scrolling through a contact list that hadn't been touched in almost as long until he found a name buried near the bottom. Tony Reyes. His thumb hovered over the call button for nearly a full minute before he finally pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered, thick with sleep and confusion. "Hello, who is this?" "Tony," Walter said quietly. "It's Walter Hayes." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, so long that Walter almost thought the call had dropped. "Coach." Tony's voice cracked suddenly wide awake. "Coach Hayes, is that really you, man? I thought I heard you disappeared. Nobody's heard from you in years. Where the hell have you been?" Walter closed his eyes. "It's a long story, Tony. I got time. Tony said immediately, and Walter could hear him sitting up, could hear the sound of a lamp clicking on somewhere in Dallas. "Coach, I've thought about calling you 100 times. After everything that happened with—" He stopped himself abruptly. "You can say his name, Tony," Walter said softly. "It's been 10 years. With Jake," Tony finished quietly. "I've thought about you every single day since the funeral, Coach. We all have. Me, Marcus, Big Dre. We tried finding you. You just vanished." Walter's throat tightened. "I needed to disappear for a while." 10 years isn't a while, Coach. That's a lifetime." A pause. "So why are you calling me at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night after a decade of silence? Something's wrong. I can hear it in your voice." Walter looked down at the black belt still resting in his lap. "I need your help, Tony." And for the next 20 minutes, Walter told him everything. About the janitor job, about Derek Collins, about the shove, the viral video, the millions of strangers online laughing at an old man falling into a bucket of dirty water, about Eli Parker's perfect punch, about the challenge, about Sunday. When he finished, there was silence on the other end of the line again, but this silence felt different, heavier. 60 seconds. Tony finally said, his voice low and dangerous, now all traces of sleepy confusion gone. "This kid gave you 60 seconds like it's some kind of mercy." "He doesn't know who I am, Tony." "No," Tony said, he doesn't, but he's about to find out. Another pause. "Coach, are you even ready? It's been 10 years. Your knees, your back." "I don't need to hit him, Tony," Walter interrupted quietly. "I just need him to understand what he's playing with. There's a difference." Tony exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "You always did believe that. Even back when you were training us. You used to say the strongest hand is the one that never has to close into a fist." "I remember what I used to say." "Yeah," Tony said, and Walter could hear the smile creeping back into his voice despite everything. "I remember too. Coach, listen to me. Whatever you need, whatever this is, I'm in. I'm not asking you to fly to Austin, Tony." "You didn't ask," Tony said firmly. "I'm telling you, I'll be there Sunday, and I'm calling Marcus and Dre the second we hang up this phone." Walter opened his mouth to protest, but Tony cut him off before he could. "Coach, 10 years ago you disappeared on us right when we needed you most. I understand why. God knows I understand why. But you don't get to disappear on us twice. Not for something like this." His voice softened. "Let us be there for you this time. Please." Walter sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the photograph on the table at 3 young champions and the man who had built them from nothing. "Okay," he finally whispered. "Sunday." He hung up the phone and sat alone in his quiet kitchen for a long time afterward, the black belt resting across his knees, feeling something he hadn't felt in 10 years stirring back to life inside his chest. It felt like hope, and it terrified him. Across town, at exactly the same hour, Derek Collins was pacing back and forth across his apartment phone pressed to his ear, his manager's voice buzzing frantically on the other end of the line. "Do you understand what you just created?" His manager, a sharp-featured man named Craig, was practically shouting through the phone. "The clip of you challenging that janitor has 4 million views already, Derek. 4 million in 6 hours. See, I told you it would blow up," Derek said, grinning at his own reflection in the window. "This isn't a good thing necessarily," Craig said. "Half the comments are calling you a bully. There's already a hashtag. Do you understand? People are calling for your sponsors to drop you." Derek's grin faltered slightly. "What? It's a fight. It's sports content. People love this stuff." "People love it when it's fair," Craig snapped. "You're a 25-year-old black belt with 15 professional wins, challenging a 60-something-year-old janitor to 60 seconds in a ring. Do you know how that looks?" "It looks like content," Derek said stubbornly, though something uneasy had crept into his voice. "Your father called me 20 minutes ago." Craig said, his tone shifting, becoming more careful. Derek stopped pacing. "What did he say?" "He wants to know what the hell you're thinking. He said if this backfires, if this makes you look cruel instead of dominant, it could cost you the contract with Titan Athletics. That's a $2 million deal, Derek. Hanging over an old man with a mop." Derek was quiet for a moment, chewing on the inside of his cheek. "It's not going to backfire," he finally said. "I'm going to walk in there Sunday. I'm going to tap him a couple times. He's going to fall down, and everyone's going to see exactly what I've been saying all along. That respect isn't given. It's taken. And people are going to eat it up because that's who I am. That's my brand." "And if he actually gets hurt?" Craig asked quietly. "Derek, he's an old man." Derek was silent for a long moment, staring out his window at the city lights below. "He shouldn't have let it get this far then," Derek finally said, his voice flat. "He could have just apologized, bowed out. He chose this." Craig sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "Just be careful, Derek. This isn't like the other stuff. This one feels different. I don't know why, but it does." Derek hung up the phone without responding, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass, and for just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Then he shook it off, cranked up the music in his apartment, and went back to practicing his post-fight victory speech in the mirror. Back at Victory Combat Academy the following morning, Marcus arrived earlier than usual, unable to sleep, his mind still churning over the strange scene from the day before. He unlocked his office, flipped on the lights, and nearly dropped his coffee when he saw Walter Hayes already standing in the center of the main training mat. Alone, in the dark, moving. Marcus froze in the doorway, coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and watched. Walter moved slowly at first, almost gently shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands rising and falling in patterns that looked less like exercise and more like poetry. But as Marcus watched, the movements began to quicken, sharpen, until Walter was flowing through a sequence so fast and so precise that Marcus's coffee cup slipped from his fingers entirely and shattered against the floor. Walter spun immediately at the sound, his whole body coiled and ready, and for one electric second, Marcus found himself staring into the eyes of a man who looked absolutely nothing like the quiet janitor who mopped floors every morning. Then Walter's shoulders relaxed, and the old familiar softness returned to his face. "Marcus," Walter said quietly, "you're here early." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the broken glass at his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Walter," he said slowly, his voice unsteady. "What in God's name was that?" Walter didn't answer right away. He walked over, calmly grabbed a broom from the corner, and began sweeping up the broken glass himself. "Walter," Marcus said again, more firmly this time, stepping fully into the room. "I've trained fighters for 15 years. I've seen national champions move. I have never in my entire career seen anyone move like that." Walter kept sweeping. "Please," Marcus said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, something raw and desperate to understand. "Who are you, really?" Walter finally stopped sweeping and looked up at him. "Sit down, Marcus," Walter said quietly. "I think it's time somebody in this gym finally knew the truth." Marcus sat down slowly on the edge of the mat, still trembling slightly from what he had just witnessed. And Walter Hayes, for the first time in 10 years, began to tell someone who he really was. He told Marcus about the gym he used to run 2 states away, a gym that had produced 3 world champions across 3 different disciplines. He told him about the reputation he had built, about coaches flying in from across the country, just to study his training methods, about being called by more than one sports journalist, the single greatest technical mind the sport had seen in a generation. Marcus listened, stunned into silence, his mouth slightly open. "Then why?" Marcus finally managed to ask, "Would someone like that be mopping floors in Austin, Texas?" Walter's face changed. The color seemed to drain slightly from it, and his hands, resting on his knees, curled slowly into fists. "I had a son," Walter said quietly. "Jake, my greatest student. Better than all 3 champions combined, honestly. I trained him myself from the time he was 6 years old. He had something special, Marcus, a gift most fighters spend their whole lives chasing and never find." "What happened to him?" Marcus asked softly, already sensing the answer, already dreading it. Walter's eyes glazed over slightly, staring at something far away, something only he could see. "There was an accident," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "During a training session. My training session. A technique I taught him, a technique I had used 1,000 times before without a single problem went wrong that day. Just once. Just one time. His hands trembled slightly. He hit his head wrong on the mat. The doctor said there was nothing anyone could have done differently. They said it was simply an accident, a terrible, random accident. Marcus's throat tightened. "Walter, I'm so sorry. I buried my son." Walter continued, his voice steady now, though tears had gathered silently in the corners of his eyes. "And 3 days later, I buried everything else too. My gym, my name, my belt. I told myself I would never step onto a mat again as a coach. I told myself the world was safer without my hands anywhere near it." The office was silent for a long moment, the only sound the distant hum of the gym's air conditioning system kicking on. "So, I became a janitor," Walter said, finally wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "In a city where nobody knew my name. I told myself it was penance. Maybe it was. Maybe it still is." Marcus sat there, absorbing everything, his mind racing to reconcile the quiet old man he had worked beside for 10 years with the legendary coach sitting in front of him now. "And Sunday," Marcus finally asked, "are you sure you're ready for this? After everything?" Walter looked up at him and something resolute settled into his expression, something that hadn't been there in a decade. "I'm not doing this for me, Marcus," Walter said quietly. "I'm doing this because I've watched that boy for 3 years and I see the same thing in him that I saw in Jake. Talent without wisdom, fire without direction." His voice hardened slightly. "I couldn't save my son in time. But maybe, just maybe, I can still save someone else's." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, understanding dawning across his face. "This was never about proving him wrong," Marcus said softly. "No," Walter agreed. "It never was." Before Marcus could respond, the office door creaked open, and both men turned to see Rachel Morgan, the gym's receptionist, standing frozen in the doorway, her keys still in her hand, having clearly overheard the entire conversation. Rachel was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, the kind of person who noticed everything happening around the gym while pretending to be absorbed in paperwork behind the front desk. She had worked at Victory Combat Academy for 4 years and had long suspected there was something unusual about the quiet janitor who arrived before anyone else and left long after everyone had gone home. "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop," Rachel said quickly, her cheeks flushing red. "I just came in early to prep the front desk for the day, and I heard voices and I—" She stopped, looking between the two men. "I'm so sorry, Walter. About your son. I had no idea." Walter nodded slowly, wiping the last traces of tears from his face. "Nobody did. That was the point." Rachel stepped fully into the room, her expression shifting from embarrassment into something more determined. "I need you to know something," she said. "I've been keeping copies of the security footage from this gym for the past 2 weeks. Every single interaction Derek's had with you, every shove, every insult, every forced apology on camera." She swallowed hard. "I didn't know why I was doing it at first. I just had a bad feeling about how this whole thing was heading. Now I think I know why." Walter looked up at her, surprised. "Rachel, you didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," Rachel said firmly, "because something tells me this Sunday isn't going to end the way Derek thinks it will. And when it's over, people are going to try to twist the story. I want the truth sitting safely somewhere nobody can erase it." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with unspoken understanding. "Thank you," Walter finally said quietly. Rachel nodded, then hesitated at the door. "Can I ask you something, Walter?" "Of course." "Are you scared?" Walter considered the question for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the empty mat outside the office window. "Terrified," he admitted quietly. "Not of Derek. Of remembering who I used to be, of opening that door again." He paused. "But I think some doors need to be opened even when they scare us, especially when they scare us." Rachel offered him a small, sad smile before disappearing back toward the front desk, leaving Marcus and Walter alone once more. "What do you need from me, Coach?" Marcus asked quietly, the words slipping out naturally now, as though it had always belonged there. Walter looked at him for a long moment, something like gratitude flickering across his weathered face. "Time," Walter said, and silence. "I need 3 days to remember how to move like myself again, and I need you to make sure nobody in this gym suspects a thing before Sunday." Marcus nodded firmly. "You've got it, Coach." For the next 3 days, something extraordinary began happening inside Victory Combat Academy, though almost nobody noticed it at first. Every morning at 4:30, a full 30 minutes before Walter's usual arrival time, 3 cars pulled quietly into the gym's back parking lot. Tony Reyes, a mountain of a man with graying temples and hands like concrete blocks, was the first to arrive from Dallas, embracing Walter so tightly in the parking lot that the old man nearly lost his breath. Behind him came Marcus's old training partner, Dre Williams, a former lightweight champion with lightning-fast footwork, even in his 40s, and finally driving in from 2 states away, a woman named Sarah Chen, a former mixed martial arts champion, who had once been considered unbeatable in her weight class. All 3 had trained under Walter Hayes at the peak of their careers. All 3 had dropped everything the moment Tony called them. Inside the darkened gym hours before any student arrived, Walter Hayes began to train again for the first time in a decade. It was not easy. His body protested against movements it had once performed effortlessly. His knees ached, his shoulders burned. On the first morning, he collapsed to the mat after only 15 minutes, gasping sweat pouring down his face, his 3 former students rushing to his side in alarm. "Coach, maybe this is too much too fast," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside him. Walter waved her off, breathing hard. "Again," he said, from the top. They trained for hours each morning before the sun rose, and slowly, painfully, something long dormant inside Walter Hayes began to wake back up. By the second morning, he was moving through techniques with more fluidity. By the third morning, when Tony threw a full speed strike toward him without warning, testing him, Walter's body reacted before his mind had even fully processed the attack, sidestepping smoothly and redirecting Tony's momentum with a single fluid motion that sent the much larger man stumbling past him entirely. Tony straightened up slowly, rubbing his shoulder, a wide grin spreading across his face. "There he is," Tony said, laughing in disbelief. "There's Coach Hayes." But not everything about those 3 days was training and reunion. On the second morning, as the 4 of them sat catching their breath near the water station, Marcus arrived earlier than expected and found something troubling waiting on his desk. A manila envelope, unmarked, slid partially under his office door sometime overnight. Inside was a printed newspaper article over a decade old, along with a note scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. "Thought you should know who your janitor really is before Sunday. Ask him about his son. Ask him what really happened during that training session." Marcus's blood ran cold as he read the words. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And whoever had left that envelope was not interested in protecting Walter's privacy. He debated telling Walter immediately, but decided against it, not wanting to add pressure to a man already carrying an unimaginable weight into Sunday's fight. Instead, Marcus folded the note carefully and locked it in his desk drawer, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Someone was digging, and digging usually meant someone was planning to use whatever they found. Meanwhile, across the gym floor during regular training hours, oblivious to everything happening in the shadows around him, Derek Collins continued preparing for Sunday with the swaggering confidence of a man who had never once considered losing. "You want to know my strategy?" Derek told a group of younger students gathered around him one afternoon, grinning as he wrapped his hands for a light workout. "I'm not even going to try hard. I'm going to walk in there, land maybe 2 clean shots, and let him fall on his own. Save my energy. Old bones break easy." Some of the students laughed along with him. Others, particularly those who had personally witnessed Walter's quiet corrections over the past few weeks, exchanged uncertain glances but said nothing. Little Eli Parker, sitting nearby on the bleachers, listened to Derek's words with a troubled expression on his young face. Over the past month, Eli had come to see Walter not just as the man who fixed his punch, but as something closer to a grandfather figure, patient and kind in a way none of the other coaches ever bothered to be. "He's not going to hurt Mr. Walter, is he?" Eli asked quietly, tugging on Marcus's sleeve later that afternoon, his young face etched with genuine worry. Marcus crouched down to the boy's level, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Walter can take care of himself, buddy. Better than you know." Eli didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded slowly, glancing across the gym toward the back office, where Walter had once again disappeared, presumably to clean something, though Eli had begun to notice the old man disappearing for suspiciously long stretches of time over the past few days. That evening, as the gym emptied out and Derek left surrounded by his usual entourage, laughing loudly about his upcoming Sunday victory, Eli lingered near the back entrance, waiting until he was sure everyone else had gone. Quietly, he slipped toward the back office and peered through the small window in the door. What he saw made his young mouth fall open in shock. Walter Hayes stood in the center of the room, moving through a sequence of strikes and blocks so fast and precise that Eli could barely track his hands, sweat glistening on his face, his old body moving with a fluid, dangerous grace that looked nothing like the gentle janitor who fixed punches with 2 quiet fingers and a soft word of encouragement. Eli's heart pounded in his small chest. He watched for nearly a full minute, frozen in place, before Walter suddenly stopped mid-motion and turned directly toward the door, as though he had somehow sensed the boy's presence the entire time. Eli froze, caught his cheeks flushing red with embarrassment. Walter's expression softened immediately when he saw who it was, and he opened the door slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Eli," Walter said gently, "you should be home by now." "You're not just a janitor," Eli whispered, his eyes still wide with amazement. "You're like a superhero or something." Walter chuckled softly, kneeling down to the boy's level, with some difficulty, his knees still aching from 3 days of intense training. "I'm just a man who used to know some things, son, that's all." "Are you going to hurt Derek on Sunday?" Eli asked, his voice small and uncertain. Walter shook his head slowly. "No, Eli, I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to teach him something. There's a difference, even if it's hard to see sometimes." Eli considered this for a long moment, his young mind working through something complicated. "My dad says the strongest people are the ones who could hurt somebody, but choose not to." Walter smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes. "Your dad sounds like a very wise man." "Can I tell people what I saw?" Eli asked hesitantly. "No," Walter said gently but firmly. "Not yet. Can you keep a secret just for a few more days?" Eli nodded solemnly, straightening his small shoulders as though accepting an important mission. "I promise, Mr. Walter." Walter placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Good man. Now go home before your parents start worrying." As Eli disappeared out the front door, practically bursting with the weight of the secret he now carried, Walter stood alone in the darkened gym, staring at the empty ring where in just 2 days everything would finally come to light. He had no way of knowing that the manila envelope sitting locked in Marcus's desk drawer was not the only threat lurking in the shadows. Because across town in Derek's father's downtown office, a private investigator was placing a thick folder on the desk in front of Richard Collins, Derek's father, a wealthy businessman who had spent his entire adult life protecting the family name at any cost. "You were right to have me look into this," the investigator said, tapping the folder. "This janitor isn't who he says he is. Walter Hayes ran one of the most respected fight gyms in the state once upon a time. Trained champions. Had a real reputation." Richard Collins leaned back in his leather chair, his expression darkening. "Then why is he mopping floors in my son's gym?" The investigator slid a second document across the desk, older, yellowed with age. "There was an incident. A death. His own son actually during a training session gone wrong. Some people in the old fighting circuit still whisper about it. Say there were questions never fully answered. Questions about whether it really was just an accident." Richard Collins's eyes narrowed sharply as he scanned the document. "This is exactly what I needed," he said slowly, a cold smile spreading across his face. "If my son loses this fight Sunday in front of millions of people, in front of every sponsor watching, it's not just embarrassing, it's catastrophic. But if we can plant just enough doubt about this Hayes character, enough suspicion about his past, about what really happened to his son—" "You'd be attacking a grieving father," the investigator said carefully. "I'd be protecting my son's legacy," Richard Collins corrected sharply, his voice hardening. "Whatever it takes." He picked up his phone immediately, already dialing a number, his eyes gleaming with cold, calculated purpose. "Get me our media team," he said into the phone. "I want a story ready to go, just in case things don't go the way we're hoping this Sunday. Something about an old dangerous scandal. Something about a man who might not be as harmless as he looks." Meanwhile, completely unaware of the storm quietly gathering against him, Walter Hayes drove home that same evening, his body sore, but his spirit steadier than it had been in 10 long years. He parked outside his small apartment above the laundromat, climbed the narrow staircase, and stood for a long moment outside his door before finally stepping inside. He walked straight to the shelf where the wooden box now sat open and picked up the old photograph of himself standing between 3 grinning champions. "2 more days, Jake," he whispered softly to the empty room, his thumb brushing gently over the faded image. "2 more days, and I'm finally going to open that door all the way." Outside his window, the sun was setting over Austin, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red, and somewhere across the city in a gleaming high-rise office, Richard Collins was putting the finishing touches on a plan designed to destroy whatever Walter Hayes was about to become. Because some men, when faced with the possibility of losing, do not simply accept defeat. They burn the entire field down first. And by Saturday morning, less than 24 hours before Walter Hayes was scheduled to step into that ring for the first time in 10 years, a single anonymous post would appear online quietly at first, then spreading like wildfire through every corner of the internet, carrying just enough truth wrapped around a devastating lie to change absolutely everything. Marcus would be the first to see it. His phone buzzing furiously at 6 in the morning, his blood running cold as he read the headline scrolling across his screen. And he would have no idea, not yet exactly how far Richard Collins was willing to go, to make sure his son never had to face the humiliation of losing to an old man with a mop. Marcus's phone would not stop buzzing. He sat up in bed at 6 in the morning on Saturday, squinting against the harsh light of his screen, and felt his stomach drop the moment he read the headline glowing back at him. "Local janitor hero has dark past sources say his own son died under suspicious circumstances during training." "No," Marcus whispered, sitting bolt upright, his thumb scrolling frantically through the article. "No, no, no." The piece was ugly, vague enough to avoid outright lawsuits, but sharp enough to plant poison in every reader's mind. It called Walter Hayes a disgraced former coach. It used phrases like questions that were never fully answered, and some in the fighting community still whisper about that night. It never once mentioned that Walter had been cleared of any wrongdoing. It never once mentioned that the accident had been ruled exactly what it was, a tragic, unforeseeable accident. It didn't need to. The damage was already done. By the time Marcus finished reading, the article had 11,000 shares. He called Walter immediately, his hands trembling as he pressed the phone to his ear. It rang 4 times before Walter finally picked up his voice, groggy with sleep. "Marcus? It's early." "Walter, you need to see something," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Before you go anywhere today, before you talk to anyone, please just check your phone." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus could hear Walter moving, could hear the creak of a chair, and then silence. A silence so complete and so heavy that Marcus felt it pressing against his own chest 3 miles away. "Walter," Marcus said softly. "Coach, are you there?" When Walter finally spoke, his voice had changed entirely. It was flat, hollow, the voice of a man standing at the edge of a wound that had never fully closed. "They used his name," Walter said quietly. "They used Jake's name in a headline." "I'm so sorry," Marcus said. "I don't know who did this, but I promise you we're going to figure it out." "I know who did this," Walter said, and something cold had entered his voice. Now something Marcus had never heard from the gentle old man before. "Derek's father has money, Marcus. Money buys silence. It also buys headlines." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Do you want to cancel tomorrow? Nobody would blame you, Walter. Not after this." There was a long pause. "Cancel," Walter finally said, and to Marcus's surprise, there was something almost like a dry, humorless laugh underneath the word. "Marcus, they just tried to use my son's death to protect a 25-year-old boy's ego. You think that makes me want to cancel, that makes me want to walk into that ring tomorrow more than I have wanted anything in 10 years. "Walter, I'll see you at the gym," Walter said. and the line went dead. Marcus sat in the darkness of his bedroom for a long moment, staring at his phone, his heart pounding. Then he dialed a second number. Rachel answered on the first ring, her voice already tense. "You saw it too." "Rachel, I need that footage," Marcus said. "All of it. Every single clip you've saved. We might need it sooner than we thought." "I'm already at the gym," Rachel said. "I couldn't sleep after I saw the article. I've been backing everything up to 3 different drives since 4 in the morning." She paused. "Marcus, this is bigger than a fight now. Someone is trying to destroy a man's reputation to save their son's pride. If they'll do this before Sunday, imagine what they'll do after, if Derek loses." Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of that realization settling over him like a stone. "Get everything ready," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we're going to need the truth standing right behind us." By 9 o'clock that morning, the article had spread far beyond Austin. Sports blogs picked it up, then bigger outlets. By noon, Derek Collins' name and Walter Hayes' name were trending together on 3 different platforms, and the tone of the internet, which had once mocked Walter mercilessly for being humiliated, had begun to shift into something far darker and more dangerous. Some people defended Walter fiercely, outraged that a grieving father's tragedy was being weaponized for content. Others, fed only the vague and cruel framing of the article, began speculating wildly, calling Walter dangerous, calling him unstable, questioning whether Derek should even be allowed to fight him at all. Derek sat in his apartment that morning, staring at his phone, watching the numbers climb his stomach, twisting into knots he didn't fully understand. "This isn't what I wanted," he muttered, scrolling through comment after comment. His father called him at exactly 11:15. "Dad," Derek answered. "Have you seen this? Someone's saying Walter's kid died because of him. Is that true? Did you know about this?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, just brief enough for Derek's stomach to sink even further. "Dad, it doesn't matter if it's fully accurate," Richard Collins said smoothly. "What matters is that it protects you. If tomorrow doesn't go the way we want this story ensures nobody takes it seriously anyway. Man like that unstable, history-grieving father who probably has some resentment issues, nobody expects you to actually lose to someone like that. And if you do well, people will understand there were factors." Derek felt something cold crawl up the back of his neck. "Wait," he said slowly. "You did this. You planted this story. I protected you," his father corrected sharply. "You used a dead kid to protect my ego." Derek said, his voice rising, something raw and unfamiliar cracking through his usual bravado. "Dad, that's messed up. That's really messed up." "Derek," his father said, his tone hardening, "do you understand what's riding on tomorrow? $2 million, your entire brand, everything I have built around your name for the last 3 years. I am not going to let some viral moment with a janitor destroy that because you got too big of a mouth in front of a camera." Derek sat in silence for a long moment, the phone pressed against his ear, staring blankly at the article still glowing on his laptop screen. "I have to go," Derek finally said quietly, and hung up before his father could respond. He sat there for nearly 20 minutes without moving, something uncomfortable churning in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to shame. Across town, back at the gym, Walter Hayes walked through the front doors at exactly noon, his face unreadable, his shoulders squared despite the storm swirling around his name online. Marcus, Rachel, and the 3 former champions were already waiting for him near the front desk, their expressions a mixture of anger and fierce protectiveness. "Coach," Tony said immediately, stepping forward, "you don't have to say a word about any of it. We've got your back, whatever happens." Walter nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Thank you, Tony." "There's something else," Rachel said, carefully holding up her phone. "I've been getting messages all morning from people who used to train under you, Walter. Word is spreading, not just the ugly stuff. People are starting to ask questions, real questions, about who you actually were before you became a janitor here." Walter closed his eyes briefly. "I suppose there's no controlling that anymore." "Maybe you don't need to control it," Sarah Chen said quietly, stepping forward. She had flown in the day before and had been staying at a hotel nearby, training with Walter in secret every morning. "Maybe it's time people finally knew the truth, all of it, not the twisted version, the real one." Walter looked around at the faces surrounding him. Marcus, who had discovered his secret only days ago and never once flinched from the truth. Rachel, who had quietly protected evidence for weeks before anyone even asked her to. Tony, Dre, and Sarah, 3 champions, who had dropped everything the moment their old coach called. Something in Walter's chest loosened slightly, the crushing weight of 10 years of silence beginning just barely to lift. "Not yet," Walter said quietly. "Tomorrow. Let tomorrow speak for itself first." That afternoon, word came that Derek had canceled 2 scheduled interviews and had not posted anything online since the article broke an unusual silence for a young man who typically documented every waking moment of his life for his followers. Craig, his manager, called him no less than 6 times, each call going straight to voicemail. Derek spent that entire afternoon alone in his apartment, the television off his phone face down on the counter, staring at nothing in particular. Around 4 o'clock there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find his younger sister Emma standing in the hallway, a worried expression on her face. "Hey," she said softly. "Dad told me about the article. I saw the comments. Are you okay?" Derek stepped aside to let her in, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Em. I keep thinking about what he said, about using that guy's kid dying to make me look better if I lose." He shook his head slowly. That's not who I thought I was. I know I've said some stuff. I know I've been a jerk to that guy, but I never wanted this." Emma sat down slowly on the edge of his couch. "Derek, can I ask you something? Why did you even challenge him in the first place?" Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Because everybody was talking about him." He finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Little kid's punch got fixed, and suddenly the whole gym is whispering behind my back like this janitor is some secret legend. And I don't know, I guess I just..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I guess I felt like I was losing something. Attention, respect, whatever you want to call it. And I didn't know how to handle that feeling, except to make him small again." Emma studied her brother's face carefully. "Do you actually think you're better than him? Like, deep down, do you really believe that?" Derek didn't answer right away. "I used to," he finally said quietly. "I'm not so sure anymore." Emma reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "Whatever happens tomorrow. Derek, I hope you remember that being strong and being kind aren't opposite things. I don't think you've ever really believed that, but I think somewhere in there you actually want to." Derek looked at his sister for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, something that looked almost like the beginning of understanding. He didn't sleep well that night. Neither did Walter. At 3 in the morning, unable to lie still any longer, Walter rose quietly from his bed, dressed in the dark, and drove to the gym alone. He unlocked the doors with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear of Derek, but from the weight of everything Sunday now represented. He walked to the center of the mat and stood there in the darkness for a long time, staring at nothing, listening to the silence of the empty building. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know if this is honoring you, Jake, or if I'm just chasing ghosts." The building offered no answer, only silence and shadow. But as the first hints of dawn began creeping through the high windows, painting pale gray light across the mat where he stood, Walter Hayes closed his eyes and for the first time in 10 years allowed himself to remember his son's voice clearly. Not the accident, not the final moment. But years earlier, a small boy laughing on this same kind of mat, throwing his very first wobbly punch, looking up at his father with pure, uncomplicated joy. "Did I do good, Dad?" Walter's eyes filled with tears in the empty gym. "You did great, son," he whispered to the memory. "You always did great." By the time the sun fully rose over Austin that Sunday morning, something had shifted inside Walter Hayes. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a weight crushing him into silence. It felt for the first time in a decade like fuel. The gym began filling with people far earlier than expected. What had originally been planned as a small, informal gathering among students and a handful of curious onlookers had exploded thanks to the viral article and the growing online frenzy into something resembling a genuine event. By 10 in the morning, over 300 people had crowded into a space meant to hold perhaps 150 comfortably. Cameras lined the walls. A live stream had been set up broadcasting to what would eventually become nearly 2 million simultaneous viewers by the time the fight began. Marcus stood near the entrance, overwhelmed by the sheer size of the crowd, watching nervously as more people continued pouring through the doors. "This wasn't supposed to be this big," he muttered to Rachel, who stood beside him, clutching a small flash drive tightly in her hand. "Nothing about this story has gone the way anyone expected," Rachel replied quietly. "I don't think today's going to be any different." Near the back of the gym, Tony, Dre, and Sarah stood together, watching the crowd with sharp, protective eyes, occasionally exchanging glances, heavy with unspoken tension. "You think he's ready?" Dre asked quietly. Tony's jaw tightened. "He has to be." At exactly 11:50, Derek Collins arrived, stepping out of a black SUV surrounded by his usual entourage, though his expression today looked noticeably different from the confident camera-ready smirk that usually accompanied his public appearances. He walked through the crowd quickly, his eyes down, barely acknowledging the sea of phones raised to capture his every movement. His father followed close behind, immaculately dressed, his expression cold and calculating, already scanning the room for any sign of weakness he could exploit if things went wrong. Craig intercepted Derek just before he reached the locker room, grabbing his arm. "Derek, listen to me," Craig said urgently. "However this goes today, however it looks, you smile, you stay composed, you control the narrative. Understand? This is bigger than a fight now. This is your entire career." Derek nodded absently, barely listening, his eyes drifting across the crowd until they landed on a small boy sitting near the front row. Eli Parker sat cross-legged on the floor beside Marcus's designated seating area. His small hands clenched nervously in his lap, his eyes wide and unblinking, watching everything unfold around him with the intense focus only a child fully invested in the outcome could manage. For a brief moment, Derek and Eli's eyes met across the crowded room. Derek expected to see excitement in the boy's face, the same electric anticipation buzzing through everyone else in the gym. Instead, he saw something that unsettled him far more deeply. Worry. Genuine protective worry, not for Derek, but for the old janitor Eli had come to love over the past several months. Derek looked away quickly, an uncomfortable feeling settling into his stomach that he couldn't quite name. At exactly noon, the crowd's restless energy shifted instantly the moment Walter Hayes walked through the back entrance. Gone was the gray janitor's uniform. In its place, Walter wore a simple black training uniform, worn but clean, with no logos, no sponsors, no flashy designs. Around his waist sat a belt so faded and soft with age that its original color had long since shifted into a deep weathered charcoal. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush as he walked toward the center mat, flanked quietly by Tony, Dre, and Sarah, three former champions whose faces many in the fighting community would have recognized instantly, though most of the general crowd had no idea who they were. Whispers rippled through the room. "Wait, is that Palm? No way, that can't be. Those are actual champions standing next to him." Marcus stepped up to a small platform near the center of the gym, raising his hands to quiet the crowd, his heart pounding as he prepared to address the largest audience Victory Combat Academy had ever hosted. "Everyone," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Before we begin, I want to address the article that's been circulating since yesterday." The room fell into tense silence. That article, Marcus continued, his voice steady, despite the nervous tremor beneath it, contained information taken wildly out of context, designed specifically to damage a good man's reputation right before this event. Walter Hayes did not do anything wrong regarding his son's death. It was a tragic accident, thoroughly investigated, and Walter was fully cleared at the time. Anyone suggesting otherwise is spreading a deliberate, cruel lie. Somewhere near the front, Richard Collins's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing. "We have documentation," Marcus continued, glancing briefly toward Rachel, who held up the small flash drive for the crowd to see, "that we will be making available after today's event addressing this and other matters. But right now we are here for one reason." He turned toward Walter, who stood calm and still in the center of the mat, and then toward Derek, who had finally emerged from the locker room, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes betraying something far more uncertain than usual. 60 seconds, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gym. That was the challenge. Let's begin. The crowd's energy shifted instantly, tension crackling through the air like electricity. Derek stepped onto the mat first, rolling his shoulders, forcing a confident smirk back onto his face for the cameras, though his movements felt slightly stiffer than usual, slightly more mechanical. Walter stepped forward to meet him in the center of the mat, calm, steady, his eyes holding none of the nervous energy radiating from nearly everyone else in the building. For a long moment, the two men simply stood there, facing each other, the entire gym holding its breath. You didn't have to go through with this, Derek said quietly, low enough that only Walter could hear him. After everything with that article, nobody would have blamed you for backing out. Walter studied him for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. I know, Walter said simply, but I'm not doing this for the people watching Derek. I'm doing this for you. Derek's brow furrowed, slightly confusion flickering across his face. What does that even mean? You'll understand soon enough, Walter said quietly, stepping back into position. Marcus raised a hand, the referee for the day, a retired fighter named James, who had agreed to oversee the informal match after hearing what was truly at stake. Fighters ready, James called out. Derek nodded, settling into his stance, years of training and instinct taking over, despite the storm of emotions still churning beneath his composed exterior. Walter simply nodded once, his hands loose at his sides, his stance relaxed in a way that looked almost careless to anyone who didn't understand what they were witnessing. The crowd's murmuring died into complete electric silence. 60 seconds, James called out. Starting now. The timer began. Derek exploded forward immediately, faster than most people in the crowd could track his first punch, snapping through the air with the kind of speed that had ended 15 professional bouts before this one. It should have connected. It didn't. Walter's body shifted at the last possible instant, a movement so small and so economical that most of the crowd barely registered it happening, and Derek's fist sailed through empty air exactly where Walter's head had been half a second earlier. A gasp rippled through the gym. Derek's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't hesitate immediately, following with a sharp kick aimed at Walter's ribs. Walter simply stepped back, the kick missing by mere inches, and something in his calm, unhurried expression sent a fresh wave of murmurs rippling through the crowd. He's not even trying to hit him back, someone near the front whispered loudly. Watch, Tony murmured to Dre beside him, a knowing smile creeping across his face. Just watch. Derek's frustration began building visibly with each passing second. He threw a combination 3 punches in rapid succession, each one faster and more aggressive than the last, his composed expression cracking slightly as every single strike found nothing but empty air. The crowd's energy shifted from confused murmuring into something closer to stunned silence. 15 seconds gone. Derek attempted a spinning back kick, a move that had knocked out 2 separate opponents during his professional career, putting his full strength and momentum behind it. Walter simply leaned back a fraction of an inch, the kick passing so close that it ruffled the fabric of his training uniform, and as Derek's momentum carried him slightly off balance from the missed strike, Walter's hand rose calmly and rested almost gently against Derek's shoulder, a light touch that could have been mistaken for nothing more than a steadying gesture. But everyone in that gym understood exactly what it meant. Walter could have ended it right there, and he hadn't. 20 seconds, James called out. Derek's chest heaved, sweat now visible on his forehead, his confident smirk long gone, replaced by something raw and increasingly desperate. Fight back, someone shouted from the crowd. Walter didn't respond to the shout, his eyes remaining fixed calmly on Derek, watching, waiting, reading every micro-movement of the young fighter's body with the practiced precision of a man who had studied thousands of fighters across decades of coaching. Derek attacked again, harder this time, a flurry of strikes designed to overwhelm through sheer volume and speed. And for the first time, Walter moved with purpose rather than simple evasion. His hands rose, deflecting 2 strikes in rapid succession, the sound of skin meeting skin sharp and startling in the otherwise silent gym, and then in one smooth, almost gentle motion, Walter redirected the momentum of Derek's third strike, turning the young fighter's own aggressive energy against him. Derek stumbled forward, caught completely off balance, his arms flailing for a split second before he managed to catch himself whirling back around, his eyes wide with something approaching genuine alarm now. 30 seconds, James called, halfway through. The crowd was on its feet now. Phones raised the tension in the room so thick it felt almost physical. "Come on, Derek!" Craig shouted from the sidelines, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. Derek's breathing had grown ragged, sweat pouring freely down his face. Now his earlier composure completely stripped away, replaced by something raw and increasingly frantic. He lunged forward with a takedown attempt, driving low and fast toward Walter's legs, a technique that had ended several of his professional matches by putting stronger, more experienced opponents flat on their backs. The crowd gasped collectively, certain this was finally the moment the old man would fall. Walter's body shifted at the exact last instant, using Derek's own forward momentum and speed against him in a single fluid, devastatingly precise motion. Derek's world spun. For one terrifying, weightless second, the entire gym watched in stunned silence as Derek Collins' undefeated black belt, 2 million followers, 15 professional wins, found himself airborne, his own momentum betraying him completely. And then with a sound that echoed through the dead silent gym like a thunderclap, Derek Collins crashed onto the mat flat on his back, the wind completely knocked from his lungs. The entire building went utterly, completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 2 million people watching online froze in stunned disbelief as the feed captured the exact moment Derek Collins hit the ground. Walter stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion, his eyes never leaving Derek's stunned, gasping face. Then slowly, deliberately, Walter did something nobody in that gym expected. He knelt down beside Derek, extending his hand toward the young fighter's trembling body, his expression soft, almost gentle. "Are you okay, son?" Walter asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the dead, silent gym, picked up perfectly by the microphones broadcasting to 2 million stunned viewers. Derek stared up at him, chest-heaving tears, unexpectedly, welling in the corners of his eyes, whether from the physical impact or something far deeper, even he couldn't fully say. And in that single frozen moment, with the entire world watching, Derek Collins realized with devastating clarity that Walter Hayes had never once during the entire 60 seconds thrown a single punch. He hadn't needed to. Somewhere near the front row, little Eli Parker leapt to his feet, tears streaming down his young face, screaming at the top of his lungs. I told you, he wasn't just a janitor!" The crowd erupted. But as the noise crashed over the gym like a wave, as phones captured the stunned, tearful face of Derek Collins reaching up to accept Walter's outstretched hand, nobody noticed Richard Collins standing frozen near the back of the room, his face pale with fury, his phone already pressed to his ear, his voice low and venomous as he issued a single chilling command to someone on the other end of the line. "Get me the media team," he snarled. "Right now! We're not done here, not even close!" And as Derek slowly rose to his feet, accepting Walter's hand, something in his eyes shifting for the very first time toward genuine humility, none of them yet understood that the hardest part of this story was not the fight at all. It was what was still coming for Walter Hayes. Richard Collins did not wait even a full hour after his son hit that mat before setting his plan into motion. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Derek was still sitting quietly in the locker room, an ice pack pressed against his ribs, staring at nothing. His father was already 3 floors up in his downtown office, surrounded by a team of media consultants, laptops, open phones ringing a war room assembled with terrifying speed and precision. "I want a counter-narrative live within the hour," Richard said, pacing behind his desk, his voice sharp and clipped. "Something that reframes today entirely." "Sir," one of the consultants said carefully, "the footage is everywhere. 2 million people watched live. There's no reframing a knockdown." "I'm not talking about the fight," Richard snapped. "I'm talking about the man. Walter Hayes just publicly humiliated my son in front of the entire country, and everyone's ready to crown him a hero. Fine. Let them. But heroes have pasts too, and I intend to make sure everyone remembers exactly what his past really is. He slid a folder across the table, the same folder his investigator had prepared days earlier. "Run it," Richard said. "All of it. The accident, the lawsuit that almost happened before it got quietly settled, the gym that shut down within a month of his son's death. Paint the picture. Grieving father, unstable, dangerous techniques, questions that were conveniently never fully investigated." "There wasn't a lawsuit," the consultant said, hesitantly scanning the document. "This says here it was considered and never filed." "Considered is enough," Richard said coldly. "People don't read footnotes. They read headlines." By 6 o'clock that evening, a second wave of articles began appearing across the internet, this time far more aggressive than the first, no longer hiding behind vague implications, but making direct, damning claims. Exclusive. The dark truth behind viral janitor champion. Former students allege dangerous training methods led to fatal accident. The article, published under a name nobody at the gym recognized, quoted 2 anonymous sources claiming Walter Hayes had a reputation for pushing his students, particularly his own son, far beyond safe limits. It suggested, without ever explicitly stating, that Jake Hayes' death may not have been the accident everyone believed. Marcus discovered the article while sitting with Walter and the others at a small diner near the gym. Everyone still processing the emotional aftermath of the fight, and his face went white as he read it silently on his phone. "Marcus," Rachel said, noticing his expression immediately. "What's wrong?" He turned his phone toward the table without a word. Walter read the headline once, then twice, his weathered face draining of color entirely. "They're not stopping," Walter said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even after today. Even after everything." Tony's fist clenched hard around his coffee cup. "Who are these anonymous sources? Nobody who ever trained under you would say something like this. Nobody." "It doesn't matter if it's true," Sarah said grimly, scrolling through the comments already flooding beneath the article. "Look how fast it's spreading. Half these people don't even question it. They just share it." Walter set his phone down slowly, his hands trembling, and stared out the diner window at nothing in particular. "Maybe I should just let it go," he said quietly. "Maybe I should have stayed a janitor. Nobody attacks a janitor's dead son." "Walter, look at me," Rachel said firmly, leaning across the table until he met her eyes. "This is exactly what they want. They want you to disappear again. They want you silent and small and defeated because that protects them. You cannot let them win by giving up now." "She's right, Coach," Dre added quietly. "You didn't do anything wrong. Not then, not now. The truth is on your side. We just need to make sure people actually hear it." Walter looked around the table at the faces surrounding him, each one fierce with a loyalty he still hadn't fully allowed himself to believe he deserved. "How?" he asked quietly. "How do we fight something like this? It's not a 60-second match, Marcus. This is different." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out the small flash drive she had been carrying protectively for days. "We fight it with the truth," she said firmly. "Every single interaction Derek had with you, every shove, every insult, every forced apology, it's all here, time-stamped, unedited, and more than that." She paused, glancing toward Tony, Dre, and Sarah. "We have 3 living, breathing champions willing to stand up and tell the real story about who you are and what actually happened that day. That's not rumor. That's not anonymous sourcing. That's the truth standing in the light." Walter was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. "There's something else," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Something none of you know. Something I never told anyone, not even the investigators at the time." The table fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "What is it, Coach?" Tony asked gently. Walter's eyes filled with tears, 10 years of buried grief threatening to break loose all at once. "The technique that day," Walter whispered. "It wasn't a standard drill. Jake had been begging me for weeks to teach him something advanced, something beyond his current level, because he wanted to surprise everyone at an upcoming tournament. I told him no over and over. He wasn't ready." Walter's voice cracked. "But he kept asking, and that morning I finally gave in. I taught him something too advanced too soon because I couldn't say no to my own son's excitement." Tears spilled freely down his weathered cheeks now. The accident wasn't random, Marcus. It happened because I broke my own rule, because I let a father's love override a coach's judgment. The diner fell into heavy, aching silence. Walter, Marcus said softly, that doesn't make it your fault. Every coach makes judgment calls. Every parent gives in sometimes. But if I had just said no one more time, you'd be torturing yourself over a different version of the same impossible grief, Sarah interrupted gently but firmly. Walter, accidents happen in this sport. They happen to the most careful coaches, the most cautious parents. You didn't do anything reckless. You made a loving decision that ended in tragedy. That is not the same as guilt. Walter wiped his eyes slowly, his hands still trembling. I've carried that secret for 10 years, he admitted quietly. I was so afraid that if anyone knew the real story, they'd see me exactly the way that article is painting me right now. Reckless, dangerous, responsible. And instead, Rachel said gently, what we see is a father who loved his son so much he couldn't say no. That's not a monster, Walter. That's just a broken heart trying to make sense of an impossible loss. Walter looked around the table once more, something shifting slowly behind his tired eyes. Maybe it's time, he finally said. Maybe it's time to stop protecting a secret that was never really mine to hide in the first place. Meanwhile, across town, Derek Collins sat alone in his apartment, staring at the same articles his father's team had unleashed onto the internet, a knot of nausea twisting tighter in his stomach with every headline he read. His phone buzzed. His father. He almost didn't answer. Almost. But something made him pick up. Dad, what is this? Derek said immediately, his voice sharp. What did you do? I protected you, Richard said smoothly. Same as before. The narrative was getting away from us, Derek. I fixed it. You destroyed an old man's reputation using his dead son. Derek said, his voice rising, shaking now with something that felt dangerously close to fury. After everything that happened today, after he had every right to hurt me and chose not to, you're using that to hurt him. Don't be naive, Richard snapped. This is how the world works. Perception is everything. You lost today badly publicly, and I am simply making sure that loss doesn't define your entire career. I don't want it fixed like this, Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. Dad, take it down. All of it. Now. It's already spreading, Derek. It's out of my hands at this point. Then get it back in your hands, Derek shouted, startling even himself with the intensity in his own voice. That man could have ended me today, could have broken every bone in my stupid, arrogant body, and instead he asked if I was okay. He offered me his hand, and you're rewarding that by dragging his dead kid through the mud for headlines. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You're getting soft, Richard finally said coldly. This business chews up soft. Maybe I don't want to be in a business that requires me to be cruel to survive, Derek said quietly, and hung up before his father could respond. He sat there for a long time afterward, his phone resting silently in his lap, staring at the article's headline glowing accusingly on his screen. Then slowly, deliberately, he opened a new browser tab and began typing. 3 days later, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a lawyer, not Richard Collins' lawyer. Rachel's cousin, a young attorney named David, who specialized in defamation cases and had been following the unfolding story online with growing outrage. I've reviewed everything Rachel sent me, David said over the phone, his voice brisk and professional. The footage, the timeline, the anonymous sourcing on these articles, this isn't just cruel journalism, Marcus. This crosses into actionable defamation, especially given what I'm seeing about where these anonymous quotes may have originated. What do you mean? Marcus asked. I mean, David said carefully, I have reason to believe I can trace at least one of those anonymous sources back to a private investigator on retainer with Collins Enterprises. If that's true and I can prove it in front of a judge, this stops being a media smear campaign. This becomes a legal case with real consequences. Marcus felt something like hope flicker to life in his chest for the first time in days. What do you need from us? Everything Rachel has, David said. And I need Walter and anyone willing to testify to his character prepared to speak publicly, officially, under oath if necessary. Marcus relayed the conversation to Walter that evening, watching carefully for his reaction. Walter sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything. "A hearing," he finally said, "in front of people, talking about Jake, about all of it." "You don't have to do this, Coach," Marcus said gently. "We can find another way." "No," Walter said, his voice steadying with something that sounded almost like resolve. "I spent 10 years hiding from the truth because I was afraid of how it would make me look. But hiding didn't protect me. It just gave people like Richard Collins room to write whatever story they wanted about who I am." He looked up, his eyes clear and determined. "It's time I told my own story in my own words before someone else finishes writing it for me." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and news of it spread almost as quickly as the original fight had. What had begun as a viral moment between an arrogant young fighter and a mysterious old janitor had transformed over the course of just 10 days into a genuine national story, one that news outlets far beyond sports blogs had begun covering with real interest. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers far more than anyone had anticipated for what was technically a modest defamation proceeding. Walter arrived flanked by Marcus Rachel and his 3 former champions, dressed simply in a dark suit that looked slightly unfamiliar on his frame, having spent so many years in gray janitor's uniforms and worn training gear. Inside the courtroom, Richard Collins sat with his own team of lawyers, his expression cold and composed, though something tight and nervous flickered behind his eyes as he watched the gallery fill with more spectators than he had expected. Derek was not sitting beside his father. He sat several rows back, alone, having arrived separately, much to his father's visible irritation. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Alvarez, called the proceedings to order, and David Rachel's cousin rose to present his case, methodically laying out the timeline of events, the footage Rachel had preserved, and the increasingly damning trail of evidence connecting the anonymous sources to Richard Collins's private investigator. "Your Honor," David said, his voice steady and confident, "what we're dealing with here is not simple sensationalized journalism. This is a deliberate, coordinated campaign to destroy the reputation of a grieving father using the tragic death of his own son as a weapon purely to protect wounded pride following a public defeat." Richard's lawyer rose immediately to object, but Judge Alvarez waved him down, her expression unreadable but attentive. "Continue," she said simply. David presented the footage first. Clip after clip of Derek's escalating cruelty toward Walter over the preceding weeks, time-stamped and unedited, playing across a screen positioned for the entire courtroom to see. The shove into the mop bucket, the locked cleaning supplies, the forced bow. A murmur rippled through the gallery, and several spectators shook their heads in visible disgust. Then David called his first witness. Marcus took the stand, describing in careful detail the moment he had discovered Walter's true history, the training sessions leading up to the fight, and the character of the man he had worked alongside for years without ever knowing the truth. "In 15 years of coaching," Marcus said, his voice thick with conviction, "I have never met anyone with more integrity than Walter Hayes. What these articles suggest about him is not just false, it's cruel." Next came Tony Reyes, then Dre Williams, then Sarah Chen, each one taking the stand to describe in vivid and emotional detail exactly who Walter Hayes had been to them, not just as a coach, but as a mentor who had shaped the entire trajectory of their lives. "He didn't just teach me how to fight," Sarah said, her voice cracking with emotion as she spoke. "He taught me who I wanted to be as a person, disciplined, patient, kind even in victory. Everything I am today, in and out of the ring, I owe to that man." The gallery had grown noticeably quiet, the earlier skepticism many had arrived with slowly softening into something closer to genuine sympathy. Then David called his final witness. "The defense calls Walter Hayes to the stand." A hush fell over the courtroom as Walter rose, slowly walked to the witness stand and took his seat, his hands folded calmly in front of him, despite the visible tremor running through them. "Mr. Hayes," David began gently, "can you tell the court in your own words what happened the day your son passed away?" Walter's eyes glistened immediately, but his voice remained steady as he began to speak, recounting the story he had shared with his closest friends only days earlier at that quiet diner table. The advanced technique, his son's excitement, his own hesitation, and ultimately his decision to give in to a father's love rather than a coach's caution. "I have carried the guilt of that decision every single day for 10 years, Walter said, his voice trembling slightly now. "I closed my gym. I changed my name in every way that mattered. I became invisible because I believed somewhere deep inside that I deserved to disappear." He paused, glancing briefly toward the gallery, toward the faces of Marcus, Rachel, Tony, Dre, and Sarah watching him with fierce, unwavering support. "But my son's death was an accident," Walter continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "A terrible, heartbreaking accident thoroughly investigated at the time and found to be exactly that. Not negligence, not recklessness. A father who loved his son enough to say yes one time too many." Tears finally spilled down his weathered face. "I have grieved that decision every single day since. But grief is not the same as guilt, and I refuse to let anyone twist my son's memory into a weapon against me any longer." The courtroom was utterly silent, several spectators visibly wiping tears from their own eyes. Judge Alvarez studied Walter for a long moment, her expression softening slightly despite her professional composure. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said quietly. "You may step down." As Walter returned to his seat, something extraordinary happened. Derek Collins rose slowly from his seat several rows back, and before his own father's lawyer could stop him, he walked forward toward the front of the courtroom. "Your Honor," Derek said, his voice unsteady but determined, "may I address the court?" Judge Alvarez studied him carefully. "This is unusual, Mr. Collins, but given the nature of these proceedings, I'll allow it. Briefly." Derek turned facing the gallery, his eyes finding his father's furious expression for only a moment before he continued. "I started this," Derek said quietly. "All of it. I shoved Walter Hayes for a joke for content because I cared more about my image than his dignity. I challenged him publicly because I couldn't handle the idea that someone else might be receiving attention I felt entitled to." His voice cracked slightly. "And when I lost fairly honorably to a man who could have hurt me badly and chose not to, my own father tried to destroy that man's reputation, using his son's death purely to protect my pride." He turned to look directly at Walter, now tears visible in his own eyes. "I didn't ask for this," Derek said. "I didn't want this. And I am deeply, truly sorry for every single thing I put you through, Mr. Hayes, not because I lost, but because of who I was while doing it." The courtroom erupted into hushed, stunned whispers. Richard Collins sat frozen in his seat, his face a mask of barely contained fury, watching his son's carefully cultivated public image dissolve in real time, though something else flickered briefly across his expression too, something that might just barely have resembled shame. Judge Alvarez allowed the silence to settle for a long moment before finally speaking. "Given the evidence presented today," she said, her voice firm and measured, "including verified footage, credible witness testimony, and a clear pattern of coordinated reputational attack, I am prepared to rule in favor of the defense. Furthermore, I strongly recommend the plaintiff's team reconsider any further publication regarding Mr. Hayes' personal history, given the substantial evidence of malicious intent presented here today." Richard Collins' lawyer immediately began quiet, urgent conversation with his client, but the outcome was already unmistakably clear to everyone in that courtroom. Walter Hayes had won. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed immediately, shouting questions, cameras flashing in rapid succession. But before Walter could say a single word to the crowd, Derek approached him quietly. Separate from the chaos, his expression raw and vulnerable, in a way none of his millions of followers had ever witnessed. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Derek said quietly. "I just needed you to know I meant every word in there." Walter studied the young man in front of him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant fighter who had shoved him into a bucket of dirty water weeks earlier, but something closer to the frightened, uncertain boy underneath all that armor of fame and bravado. "I already forgave you, son," Walter said quietly. "The moment you helped me up off that mat with your eyes instead of your hands, I saw something change in you that day. I just needed you to see it too." Derek's eyes filled with fresh tears. "How do I fix this? How do I become someone worth forgiving?" Walter placed a gentle, weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "You start," Walter said quietly, "by learning that strength was never about how hard you can hit someone. It's about how much better you can make the world around you, one honest choice at a time. Derek nodded slowly, wiping his eyes, something settling into his expression that looked for the first time since anyone had known him genuinely humble. As the crowd of reporters continued shouting questions from a respectful distance, Marcus, Rachel, Tony, Dre, and Sarah gathered around Walter, forming a quiet, protective circle around the man who had spent 10 years hiding from a world that had just witnessed in vivid and undeniable detail exactly who he truly was. But even as the cameras captured this moment of vindication, even as the internet began flooding with support and admiration rather than mockery, none of them yet knew that the truest, most important part of Walter Hayes' story had not yet been told. Because standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching everything unfold, with tears streaming silently down her face, stood a woman none of them recognized. A woman who moments later would step forward, introduce herself, and reveal a piece of Walter's past that even he had never fully known. The woman stood at the edge of the crowd for a long moment before she finally moved her steps, hesitant, almost afraid, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head and still wasn't sure she had the courage to go through with it. She looked to be in her late 50s, silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, her coat clutched tightly around her despite the warm afternoon sun. Her eyes red-rimmed and glassy, never once left Walter's face as she approached. Rachel noticed her first nudging Marcus gently. "Who is that?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "I have no idea." The woman stopped a few feet from Walter, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small leather journal against her chest. "Walter Hayes," she said, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the dispersing crowd. Walter turned toward her, something flickering across his face, a distant, uncertain recognition tugging at the edges of his memory. "Yes," he said slowly. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The woman's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak at all. "My name is Diane Foster," she finally said. 10 years ago, I was the nurse on duty at St. Michael's the night your son was brought in." The air around them seemed to still completely. Tony, Dre, and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus took an instinctive half-step closer to Walter, as though bracing to catch him if his knees buckled. Walter's face went pale, his breath catching audibly in his throat. "I've thought about reaching out to you for 10 years, Diane continued, tears now spilling freely down her cheeks. "I saw the article, I saw all of it, and I couldn't stay silent anymore, not after watching what they tried to do to you." "What do you mean?" Walter asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it you needed to tell me?" Diane opened the worn leather journal in her hands, her fingers trembling as she turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "I kept notes," she said. "Every nurse does informally, especially on cases that stay with you. And your son's case stayed with me, Mr. Hayes. For 10 years it stayed with me." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of grief and urgency. There's something in the medical examiner's original notes that never made it into the official public report. Something the hospital board quietly decided wasn't relevant enough to include, because by the time they reviewed it, the case was already closed, and nobody wanted to reopen old wounds. Walter's hands had begun to shake violently now. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Please just tell me." Diane took a steadying breath. "Jake didn't die from the fall itself," she said quietly. "The fall caused a concussion, yes, but it wasn't severe. Not fatal on its own. What killed your son, Mr. Hayes, was an undiagnosed heart condition, a congenital defect extremely rare that made his heart vulnerable to any sudden trauma or extreme physical exertion. The kind of condition that gives no warning signs. The kind that could have triggered under a dozen completely ordinary circumstances that had absolutely nothing to do with any technique you taught him that day." The world seemed to tilt beneath Walter's feet. "What? What are you saying?" he whispered. "I'm saying," Diane said, gently reaching out to steady his arm, "that even if you had never taught him that technique, even if that training session had never happened at all, your son's heart could have failed during any ordinary run, any ordinary sparring match, any ordinary moment of childhood excitement. It was a ticking clock nobody knew existed, Mr. Hayes. Not you, not Jake, not anyone." Her voice broke slightly. "It was never your fault, not even close. And I have carried the guilt of not telling you sooner for 10 long years." Walter stood frozen, his entire body trembling, tears streaming freely down his weathered face as 10 years of buried, suffocating guilt began cracking open all at once. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" he asked, his voice raw with anguish. "Why did I spend 10 years believing I killed my own son?" The hospital's legal team decided it wasn't necessary information for the family at the time, Diane said, shame heavy in her voice. "They said the outcome was the same either way, so revisiting the cause wouldn't change anything practical." I disagreed. "I fought for you to be told, but I was young and I was overruled, and I have regretted my silence every single day since." She reached out and gently placed the leather journal in Walter's trembling hands. "I brought you my original notes, copies of the examiner's findings, everything I could gather. I should have found you years ago. I'm so sorry it took this long." Walter stared down at the journal in his hands, his entire body shaking, and then without warning, his knees finally buckled beneath the overwhelming weight of 10 years of misplaced guilt finally lifting from his shoulders all at once. Tony and Marcus caught him immediately, lowering him gently onto the courthouse steps, and for the first time in a decade, Walter Hayes broke down completely, sobbing openly in front of everyone, his whole body shaking, with a grief that had finally, after 10 agonizing years, found room to breathe. "He's okay," Tony said quickly to the small crowd of reporters that had begun to gather again, waving them back with a firm hand. "Give him space, please." Marcus knelt beside Walter, one hand resting firmly on his old friend's shoulder. "Coach," he said softly, "did you hear her? It wasn't you. It was never you." Walter looked up at him through tears, his voice barely a whisper. 10 years, Marcus. 10 years I punished myself for something I never even did." "You didn't punish yourself for nothing," Rachel said gently, kneeling on his other side. "You honored your son's memory the only way you knew how. That love was never wasted, Walter, even if the guilt attached to it was built on a lie you didn't know you were carrying." Eli Parker, who had been brought to the courthouse that day by Marcus's insistence, despite his young age, pushed through the small circle of adults and wrapped his small arms tightly around Walter's neck, saying nothing at all, simply holding on with all the fierce, uncomplicated love only a child could offer in a moment too heavy for words. Walter held the boy tightly, his tears finally beginning to slow, something like peace settling gently over his tear-streaked face for the first time in a decade. "Thank you," he finally whispered to Diane, still standing quietly nearby, her own eyes wet with tears. "You have no idea what you just gave me." "I think I have some idea," Diane said softly. "I've watched what guilt like that does to people, Mr. Hayes. I'm just sorry I didn't have the courage to bring you this truth sooner." Across the courthouse plaza, Derek Collins had watched the entire scene unfold from a respectful distance. His own eyes wet, something shifting even more deeply inside him as he witnessed the raw, unguarded humanity of a man he had spent months mocking without ever once considering the weight he might be carrying. His father, however, watched the scene with a colder, more calculating eye, already turning to his remaining lawyer, already whispering about damage control, about how to spin even this moment into something salvageable for his son's career. But for the first time in his life, Derek Collins was no longer listening to his father at all. He walked forward instead, kneeling slowly beside Walter on the courthouse steps, ignoring the cameras still capturing every angle of the unfolding moment. "Mr. Hayes," Derek said quietly, "I know I have no right to be here right now, but I just wanted you to know whatever you need, whatever this takes, I'm not walking away like my father would. Not this time." Walter looked up at him, still wiping tears from his weathered face, and for a long moment simply studied the young man kneeling in front of him. "You already gave me something today I didn't expect," Walter said quietly. "You stood up in that courtroom and told the truth, even when it cost you everything with your father. That took more courage than 60 seconds on a mat ever could." Derek's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I don't know how to be different, Mr. Hayes. I don't know how to undo who I've been." Walter reached out and placed a steady, weathered hand on Derek's shoulder. "Nobody undoes who they've been, son," Walter said gently. "You just decide every single day from now on who you're going to become instead. That's all any of us can do." The courthouse steps grew quiet around them, the reporters slowly lowering their cameras, sensing correctly that they were witnessing something far too sacred to interrupt with shouted questions. In the days that followed, everything about the story shifted entirely. The defamation case against Richard Collins's media team moved swiftly through additional legal proceedings, ultimately resulting in a public retraction from every outlet that had run the false articles, along with a substantial settlement that Walter, after long consideration, chose to donate almost entirely toward funding scholarships for underprivileged young fighters, a decision that made headlines nearly as large as the original scandal itself. Richard Collins's business reputation suffered considerably in the aftermath, several partners quietly distancing themselves from a man now publicly associated with weaponizing a grieving father's tragedy for corporate gain. Whispers began circulating within his own industry, questioning his judgment, his ethics, his character. For the first time in his long, ruthless career, Richard Collins found himself on the receiving end of exactly the kind of reputational damage he had so casually inflicted on others. Derek, meanwhile, made a decision that shocked everyone who had followed his career, including his own management team. He publicly terminated his contract with Titan Athletics, releasing a statement explaining that he could no longer, in good conscience, represent a brand built around a persona he no longer recognized as authentic. He stepped back from social media entirely for nearly a month. A silence that generated more speculation and genuine curiosity than any of his previous viral content ever had. When he finally returned online, it was with a single, simple video, no flashy editing, no dramatic music. Just Derek sitting quietly in front of a camera, speaking directly and honestly about everything that had happened about the person he had been and the person he was trying imperfectly to become instead. The video reached nearly 5 million views within a week, though this time, the comments beneath it looked entirely different from anything Derek had experienced before. Genuine, reflective, supportive in a way that felt earned rather than performed. But the most significant change of all happened quietly, away from cameras, entirely inside Victory Combat Academy itself. Walter returned to the gym the following Monday, and as he walked through the front doors, still dressed in his familiar gray uniform, mop in hand out of sheer old habit, the entire gym erupted into spontaneous applause, students and coaches alike rising to their feet, some with tears in their eyes. All of them finally understanding exactly who had been quietly mopping their floors for the past decade. Marcus stepped forward, holding out a small velvet box. "Coach," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "The ownership board met this weekend. Unanimous vote. We'd like to offer you the head coaching position at this gym effective immediately. No more mop, no more silence, just teaching the way you were always meant to." Walter stared at the box, then at the sea of faces surrounding him, students young and old, coaches who had worked beside him for years without knowing his name, and finally standing quietly near the back of the crowd, Derek Collins, who had returned that morning not as a fighter, but simply as a man hoping to learn something real. Walter's throat tightened with emotion as he accepted the box, opening it slowly to find a simple, elegant coaching whistle inside engraved with 3 words. "Coach Walter Hayes." "I don't know what to say," Walter whispered. "Say yes," Eli Parker called out from the front of the crowd, grinning ear to ear, and the entire gym erupted into laughter and applause once more. Walter looked down at the whistle in his trembling hands, then up at the faces surrounding him, feeling for the first time in 10 years like a door long sealed shut had finally fully swung open. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I accept." The applause that followed shook the entire building, but as Walter stood there, surrounded by students and champions, and a young boy who had believed in him before anyone else dared to, his eyes drifted briefly toward the back of the gym, toward the quiet office where a wooden box still sat, lit open a faded photograph of 3 champions and 1 proud coach resting gently on top. He thought of Jake, of 10 years of misplaced guilt finally lifted, of a truth buried too long finally brought into the light. And as Marcus called the gym to order, as Derek stepped forward, hesitantly asking quietly whether he might be allowed to start training under Walter's guidance from the very beginning, learning not just technique but the deeper lessons underneath it all. Walter Hayes smiled for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't found in 60 seconds inside a ring. Sometimes it's found in finally forgiving yourself for a mistake you never actually made. The following morning, Derek Collins arrived at Victory Combat Academy before 6 o'clock, a full hour before his first scheduled training session, and found Walter already there, exactly as he had been for 10 years, sweeping quietly near the front entrance, out of nothing but old habit. "Coach," Derek said quietly, testing the word on his tongue for the very first time. Walter looked up, something warm flickering across his face. "You're early. I figured if I was really doing this," Derek said, "I should start the way you always did, before anyone else shows up. No cameras, no audience." He hesitated. "Just work." Walter studied him for a long moment, then handed him a second broom without a word. Derek stared at it, confused. "I thought I was here to train." "You are," Walter said simply. Lesson 1. For the next hour, in near total silence, Derek Collins swept the same floors he had once mocked an old man for cleaning, and something about the simplicity of the task, the total absence of applause or attention, settled into his chest in a way that felt strange and uncomfortable and somehow exactly right. "I don't get it," Derek finally admitted, pausing halfway through. "What does sweeping have to do with fighting?" Walter continued working unhurried. "Everything you've ever learned in this sport, Derek, you learned because someone was watching. Cameras, crowds, followers counting every win. I want you to learn something without anyone watching at all. I want you to discover who you are when there's no reward waiting at the end of it." Derek was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that. "My whole life," he finally said, "I thought that was weakness, doing something nobody sees." "Most people do," Walter said. "That's exactly why so few people ever become truly strong." Over the following weeks, Derek returned every single morning, arriving earlier and earlier, gradually shedding layer after layer of the performance he had spent years building around himself. Walter taught him nothing about fighting during those first 2 weeks. Not one technique, not one drill. Instead, Derek mopped floors, repaired torn equipment, wiped down mirrors, and sat quietly beside Walter as the old man corrected young students' stances with the same 2 gentle fingers that had once fixed Eli Parker's punch in a single afternoon. "When do we actually train?" Derek finally asked one morning, frustration creeping into his voice. Walter didn't even look up from the heavy bag he was stitching. "We've been training since your first morning here, son. You just haven't recognized the lesson yet." "I don't understand." "You will," Walter said simply. And slowly, painfully, Derek began to understand exactly what Walter meant. Word of Derek's transformation spread quickly, not through viral videos or dramatic announcements, but through the quiet, steady testimony of students who watched him kneel down beside struggling children, patiently helping them the way Walter had once patiently helped him find humility on a mat in front of millions. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after the courthouse hearing, Eli Parker approached Derek nervously during a break, clutching his gloves tightly against his small chest. "Can you help me with my kick?" Eli asked. "Coach Walter's busy with the new students, and yours is really good." Derek blinked, surprised. This was the same boy who had once looked at him with nothing but wary suspicion. The same boy who had screamed in triumph the moment Derek hit that mat. "You want my help?" Derek asked. Eli shrugged, suddenly shy. "Coach Walter says everybody's got something to teach somebody if you're willing to actually listen." Something tightened in Derek's chest, warm and unfamiliar. "Okay," Derek said quietly, kneeling down to the boy's level, exactly the way he had watched Walter do 100 times now. "Show me what you've got." As Derek gently adjusted Eli's stance, correcting the angle of his hip, something in the boy's face lit up with pure, uncomplicated joy, and across the gym, watching quietly from near the front office, Walter felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of his eyes. "He's really doing it," Marcus said softly, coming to stand beside him. "He's actually changing." "People can always change," Walter said quietly. "The question is whether they're finally ready to." But not everyone in Derek's life had accepted the transformation so gracefully. Richard Collins had watched his son's decline into what he privately called irrelevance, with growing fury over those 2 months, his once promising $2 million prospect, now spending his mornings sweeping floors instead of building his brand, his social media accounts, quiet, his sponsorships gone entirely. "You're throwing away everything I built for you," Richard said one evening, having shown up unannounced at Derek's apartment, his expression tight with barely restrained anger. "You didn't build anything for me, Dad," Derek said calmly, no longer flinching the way he once would have. "You built a version of me you could profit from. There's a difference. That version of you had 2 million followers and a Titan Athletics contract worth more money than you'll make in the next decade doing whatever this is. That version of me shoved an old man into a bucket of dirty water for a laugh," Derek said, his voice steady. "That version of me is exactly who I don't want to be anymore." Richard's jaw tightened. "So this is it. You're going to spend your life sweeping floors for a broken-down old janitor." "He's not broken down," Derek said sharply, something fierce entering his voice for the first time. "He's the strongest person I have ever met in my entire life, and if learning to be even half the man he is means I have to sweep floors for the next 10 years, then that's exactly what I'm going to do." Richard stared at his son for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his cold eyes. "You're making a mistake," he finally said, turning toward the door. "Maybe," Derek said quietly, "but it's mine to make. For the first time in my life, it's actually mine." Richard left without another word, and Derek stood alone in his apartment for a long time afterward, feeling, despite the ache of his father's disapproval, lighter than he had felt in years. 3 months after the courthouse hearing, Walter gathered Marcus, Rachel, Tony, Dre, Sarah, and somewhat hesitantly Derek into the gym's back office one evening after closing. "I've been thinking about something," Walter said, setting a folder down on the desk in front of them. "For 10 years I hid from this world because I was afraid of what it would cost me to step back into it. But standing in that courthouse, hearing Diane's truth, watching Derek find his own way toward something better, I realized something." He opened the folder, revealing a simple hand-drawn proposal. "I want to start a program," Walter continued. "Free training open to any child in this city whose family can't afford lessons. Real coaching, real discipline, not for trophies, not for followers. For the same reason I first fell in love with this sport before I ever cared about championships or reputation." Rachel's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Walter, that's beautiful." "I want to name it after Jake," Walter said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "The Jake Hayes Foundation. Every child who walks through those doors will learn the same lesson I failed to fully teach my own son in time. That strength isn't about what you can do to other people. It's about who you choose to become despite everything life throws at you." The room fell silent for a long moment, heavy with emotion. "I'd like to help," Derek said quietly, breaking the silence. "If you'll let me. I know I don't deserve a place in something built around your son's memory, not after everything I've done. But I want to earn it if you'll give me the chance." Walter looked at the young man in front of him, seeing not the arrogant fighter who had once shoved him into a bucket of dirty water, but someone genuinely transformed, someone who had spent 3 months quietly proving through action rather than words that real change was possible. "Jake would have liked you," Walter said softly. "Eventually, after you cleaned about 100 more toilets." The room erupted into much-needed laughter, breaking the tension, and Derek laughed along with them, wiping unexpected tears from his own eyes. The Jake Hayes Foundation opened its doors 6 weeks later in a modest space adjacent to Victory Combat Academy, funded partially by Walter's defamation settlement and partially by an outpouring of donations from people all across the country who had followed the story and been moved by Walter's journey from mockery to redemption. On opening day, over 200 children showed up, many from families who had never been able to afford proper training, their eyes wide with excitement as they stepped onto mats for the very first time. Eli Parker, now firmly established as one of the gym's most promising young students, proudly walked new kids through their first stances, mimicking Walter's gentle patient corrections with startling precision for a boy his age. "You're getting good at that," Walter said, watching him with a proud smile. "I learned from the best," Eli said, matter-of-factly grinning up at him. Near the back of the room, Derek worked patiently with a group of nervous 8-year-olds kneeling down to their level exactly the way Walter had taught him, his voice gentle and encouraging in a way that would have been utterly unrecognizable to anyone who had known him just months earlier. Marcus watched the entire scene unfold with quiet wonder, standing beside Rachel near the entrance. "Who would have thought," Marcus said softly, "that shove into a bucket of dirty water would lead to all of this? Sometimes the worst moments end up cracking us open just enough to let something better in," Rachel said quietly. But even amid the joy of that opening day, a shadow lingered at the edges of the celebration. Richard Collins had not spoken to his son in nearly 2 months, and Derek, despite his newfound peace, still carried a quiet ache over the fractured relationship, one he had not yet found the courage to address directly. That courage would come sooner than he expected. Nearly 4 months after the courthouse hearing, as the Jake Hayes Foundation celebrated its growing success, with over 400 enrolled students and a waiting list stretching well into the following year, Walter received an unexpected phone call one evening. "Mr. Hayes," an unfamiliar voice said cautiously. "This is Craig, Derek's former manager." Walter's brow furrowed. "Craig, it's been a while. I need to tell you something," Craig said, his voice tight with urgency. "Richard Collins is planning something, a media event scheduled for this Friday right outside your foundation's doors. He's invited several major news outlets. He's calling it an exposé on what he's describing as, and I'm quoting directly here, the manipulation of my son by a manipulative, calculating con artist using grief as a business strategy." Walter felt his stomach drop. "He's still trying to destroy this," Walter said quietly, more to himself than to Craig. "He's furious, Mr. Hayes. Derek cutting ties with him, publicly losing the Titan Athletics deal, spending his time sweeping floors instead of building the brand Richard spent years constructing. He sees all of it as a personal humiliation, and he's not the kind of man who lets humiliation go unanswered." Walter closed his eyes, exhaustion and dread washing over him in equal measure. "Does Derek know?" "No," Craig said. "I don't think he does. I only found out because I still have contacts inside Richard's team. I thought you deserved to know before Friday, given everything you've already been through." Walter thanked Craig quietly and hung up the phone, sitting alone in the gym's back office for a long time afterwards, staring at the framed photograph now hanging proudly on the wall, Jake's smiling young face grinning back at him from a decade earlier. "Not again," Walter whispered softly. "I won't let him do this again." He called Marcus immediately, then Rachel. Then, after a long moment of hesitation, Derek himself. When Derek arrived at the gym 20 minutes later, his face pale with a mixture of confusion and dread, Walter told him everything Craig had shared. Derek's hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening with barely restrained fury. "He's not stopping," Derek said quietly. "Even now, even after everything. Some people," Walter said gently, "measure their own worth by how completely they can control everyone around them. When that control slips even a little, it terrifies them more than anything else in the world." "What do we do?" Derek asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Walter considered the question carefully for a long moment. "We don't hide," Walter finally said. "We don't run. We meet Friday head-on with the same thing that saved us the first time." "The truth," Rachel said, understanding immediately. Walter nodded. "Except this time it's not going to come from a courtroom. It's going to come from a foundation full of children whose lives have already been changed, standing as living proof of exactly what this program actually is." Friday arrived with a tension thick enough to feel in the air the moment Richard Collins's black SUV pulled up outside the foundation, trailed by 3 television vans and a small crowd of reporters eager for a dramatic story. Richard stepped out immaculately dressed as always, his expression carrying the same cold, calculated confidence Walter remembered from the courthouse steps months earlier. But this time, Walter was not standing alone. Behind him stood Marcus, Rachel, Tony, Dre, Sarah, and Derek. And behind all of them, filling the entire front lawn of the foundation, stood over 150 children, their parents standing proudly alongside them, having been quietly informed the day before about what was coming, and asked gently whether they might be willing to show up in support. Every single family had said yes. Richard's confident stride faltered slightly as he took in the sheer size of the crowd assembled before him, clearly far larger and more organized than he had anticipated. "Mr. Collins," a reporter called out immediately, sensing the shifting dynamic. "You've made some serious allegations about this foundation. Care to elaborate for the cameras?" Richard straightened his jacket, forcing his composed expression back into place. "I'm here to expose the truth about a man who has manipulated public sympathy for personal gain using a fabricated narrative of grief and redemption to—" "Fabricated," a voice interrupted sharply. The crowd turned as a woman stepped forward from among the parents, holding the hand of a small girl who had until 3 months earlier been unable to afford training anywhere in the city. "My daughter has a rare form of scoliosis," the woman said, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "Doctors told us physical activity could help strengthen her back, but private training was completely out of our budget. This program, this foundation you're calling fabricated, gave my daughter something no other place in this city was willing to give her for free. Confidence, strength, community." She turned to glare directly at Richard. "You want to talk about manipulation? Try explaining to a room full of grateful parents why you're standing on this lawn trying to destroy the one place that's actually helped our kids." The reporters immediately turned their cameras toward her, sensing the story shifting dramatically in real time. Richard's jaw tightened, visibly rattled now. "This is simply one testimonial. It doesn't—" "I have another one," a second parent called out, stepping forward, then a third, then a fourth. One after another, parents stepped forward, sharing stories of children who had found discipline, confidence, and genuine community within the walls of the Jake Hayes Foundation, their voices growing louder and more passionate with each testimony, until Richard Collins found himself standing alone at the center of a crowd that had transformed entirely without his control into a powerful, undeniable wall of gratitude and support. Derek stepped forward, finally, standing directly in front of his father for the first time since their apartment confrontation months earlier. "Dad," Derek said quietly, though his voice carried clearly across the now silent crowd, the cameras capturing every word. "I know why you're really here. This isn't about exposing manipulation. This is about you not being able to control the story anymore, about watching me choose something you can't take credit for." Richard's expression flickered something raw and uncomfortable, breaking through his carefully maintained composure for just a moment. "I built everything you have." Richard said, his voice lower now, meant only for Derek, though the nearby microphone still picked it up clearly. "No," Derek said firmly. "You built a brand. Walter built a man. And for the first time in my entire life, I actually like who I'm becoming." The crowd fell into a heavy, charged silence, every camera fixed on the raw, unfiltered exchange between father and son. Richard stood frozen for a long moment, staring at his son, something shifting almost imperceptibly behind his cold eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his car, his lawyers and media team trailing awkwardly behind him, the story he had planned to control instead slipping entirely and irreversibly out of his hands. The crowd remained silent until the SUV pulled away completely. And then slowly the tension broke into something warmer, parents embracing their children, reporters lowering their cameras with expressions of genuine, unscripted emotion. Walter approached Derek, slowly placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "That took real courage," Walter said quietly. Derek's eyes glistened with tears he no longer bothered hiding. "I learned from someone who taught me real courage doesn't need an audience. It just showed up anyway." That evening's news coverage told a story entirely different from the one Richard Collins had intended, focusing not on manufactured scandal, but on the overwhelming, undeniable impact of the Jake Hayes Foundation, and by morning donations and enrollment applications had tripled overnight. Richard Collins largely disappeared from public life in the months that followed his business reputation, never fully recovering from the accumulated weight of his own choices. Though whether he ever truly reflected on the deeper lessons of that period remains something only he would ever know. Derek, meanwhile, continued showing up every single morning, sweeping floors, correcting stances, sitting quietly beside Walter as the old man passed down not just technique, but an entire philosophy of strength that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with character. 1 year after that first fateful shove into a bucket of dirty water, Victory Combat Academy hosted a small, quiet ceremony to celebrate the Jake Hayes Foundation's first full year of operation. Over 600 children had trained through the program, by that point many of them competing, several of them beginning to show the kind of natural talent that Walter recognized instantly from decades of experience. Eli Parker, now 11 years old, stood at the front of the gathered crowd, having been asked to say a few words as the Foundation's very first student. "A year ago," Eli said, his small voice carrying with surprising confidence across the packed room, "I thought Mr. Walter was just the janitor who fixed my punch one time by accident. Now I know he's the strongest person I've ever met, not because he can win a fight, but because he taught all of us that being strong means being kind, even when nobody's watching, and being honest, even when the truth is really hard." The room erupted into warm applause, several parents wiping away tears. Derek stood near the back of the crowd, watching the ceremony unfold with quiet pride. His own transformation now so complete that many newer students had no idea he had ever been anything other than one of Walter's most dedicated assistant coaches. After the ceremony ended, as the crowd slowly dispersed into the warm evening, Walter found himself alone for a rare quiet moment, standing in the center of the mat where exactly 1 year earlier he had stepped forward to face Derek Collins for the first time in a decade. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to remember his son fully, without the crushing weight of unearned guilt that had suffocated that memory for so long. "We did it, Jake," Walter whispered softly to the empty room. "We finally did it." "Talking to yourself, old man?" Walter opened his eyes to find Derek standing nearby, a familiar mop in his hands, a warm, easy smile on his face that looked nothing like the arrogant smirk from a year earlier. "Just catching up with an old friend," Walter said quietly. Derek nodded, understanding immediately, and moved to stand beside him. "Can I ask you something, Coach?" Derek said after a moment. "Do you ever regret it?" "Everything that happened. The article, the courthouse, all of it." Walter considered the question carefully, watching the late afternoon light shift softly across the empty mat. "For 10 years. Walter finally said, "I believed silence was the safest way to honor my son's memory. I believed disappearing was penance, but watching what's grown out of all of this, watching hundreds of children find confidence and discipline in his name, watching you become someone genuinely good instead of just genuinely admired." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Derek, I don't regret any of it. Not the shove, not the article, not even the 60 seconds in that ring. Every single piece of it led us here." Derek was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that. "I used to think being on top of everyone else was the whole point," Derek finally admitted. "Now I think maybe the whole point was learning I never needed to be on top of anyone at all." Walter smiled, placing a warm, weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "Now you understand," Walter said quietly. "Real strength was never about proving yourself against someone else. It's about the quiet decision made over and over, day after day, when nobody's watching, to become someone worth being." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, two men from vastly different worlds, brought together by a single moment of cruelty that had somehow transformed against every possible expectation into something profoundly redemptive. Years passed, as years always do, carrying the story of Walter Hayes and Derek Collins far beyond the walls of that single Austin gym. The Jake Hayes Foundation expanded into 3 additional cities, funded largely by continued donations from people around the world who had followed the story and found something deeply meaningful in its unlikely arc from humiliation to healing. Tony, Dre, and Sarah each returned periodically to help train new coaches, ensuring Walter's philosophy of discipline and humility spread far beyond what any single person could teach alone. Eli Parker grew into one of the Foundation's most talented young fighters, eventually earning a scholarship to compete nationally, always crediting the quiet janitor, who had once fixed his punch with 2 gentle fingers and a few soft words of encouragement, as the single greatest influence of his entire life. Rachel eventually became the Foundation's full-time director, her sharp instincts and quiet loyalty proving invaluable as the organization continued growing far beyond its humble beginnings. And Derek Collins, the arrogant young fighter who had once shoved an old janitor into a bucket of dirty water, purely for entertainment, eventually became a certified head coach in his own right, running his own branch of the Jake Hayes Foundation, dedicating his entire career to teaching young fighters the same lessons that had once transformed his own broken, hollow understanding of strength into something real and lasting. He rarely spoke publicly about his past, but when he did, he always ended with the same simple truth. "The best thing that ever happened to me," Derek would say, "was getting knocked down by a man who could have destroyed me completely and chose instead to offer me his hand." As for Walter Hayes, he continued coaching well into his later years, his reputation eventually growing far beyond Austin, far beyond even the initial viral fight that had first brought his story into the world's attention. He never sought fame. He never chased recognition. He simply continued showing up every single morning exactly as he always had, teaching each new generation of students the same lessons his own son had once taught him about patience, humility, and the quiet, unglamorous power of genuine kindness. On the 10th anniversary of the Jake Hayes Foundation's opening, a young journalist researching a feature story on unlikely redemption arcs sat down with Walter for what would become one of the final extensive interviews of his life. "Looking back on everything," the journalist asked, "the shove, the viral video, the lawsuit, the courthouse hearing, all of it, what do you want people to remember most?" Walter considered this question for a long, thoughtful moment, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, his eyes carrying the quiet wisdom of a man who had survived the deepest possible grief and emerged against every reasonable expectation into something resembling peace. "People love talking about that 60-second fight," Walter finally said, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "But the fight was never the important part. It never was." "Then what was, Pa?" the journalist asked. Walter's eyes drifted just briefly toward a framed photograph resting on a nearby shelf. 3 champions and 1 grinning young boy captured forever in a single treasured moment of pure joy. "The important part," Walter said softly, "was learning who we truly are when nobody's watching. Derek learned that lesson the hard way on a mat in front of millions of strangers. I learned it the hard way too, hiding behind a mop for 10 long years, terrified of my own reflection." He paused, his voice steady and certain. "But here's what I want people to understand more than anything else in this entire story. The strongest person in any room isn't the one who can hurt everyone around them. It never was. The strongest person is the one who has the power to walk away and chooses instead to offer their hand." The journalist sat in respectful silence for a long moment, deeply moved by the simple, profound truth of Walter's words. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks, the quiet figure mopping floors before the sun even rises, carries within them more wisdom, more strength, and more capacity for grace than anyone watching could ever possibly imagine. And sometimes all it takes is one single act of cruelty, one careless shove meant to humiliate, to finally set free a story of redemption, powerful enough to change not just 2 men's lives, but the lives of every single person, fortunate enough to witness it unfold. Walter Hayes never sought to be a hero. He never wanted fame, recognition, or vindication. He simply wanted to honor his son's memory the only way he knew how, through quiet, unwavering integrity, even when the whole world seemed determined to tear that integrity apart. And in the end, that quiet integrity became the very thing that saved him, transformed a broken young man into someone genuinely good, and built a legacy far greater than any championship belt or viral moment could ever hope to achieve. Because true strength was never about how hard you could hit someone. It was always about how much better you could make the world around you one honest, unwatched choice at a time. That is the story of Walter Hayes, the old janitor everyone ignored, and the cocky young champion who learned in the most unexpected way imaginable that real power was never about being feared. It was about being worthy of trust. And that lesson, born from a single careless shove into a bucket of dirty water, would go on to change thousands of lives for generations to come.